A 7-year-old girl is tied to a tree inside a burning forest. Her stepfather left her there. Not by accident, on purpose. Her name is Laya, and the man who was supposed to protect her is the same man who lit the match. Miles away, a woman with scars older than most people's entire lives rides alone through the Montana dark. She doesn't save people anymore. She stopped doing that a long time ago. But tonight, the wind carries something different, something that sounds like a child screaming, and Mara Vale has never been good at riding away. If you've ever believed that the most dangerous protectors aren't the ones wearing badges, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's see where you're watching from tonight. The fire had been burning for 40 minutes before anyone in Cutler Creek called it in. That was the first thing that would haunt Mara Vale later, in the sleepless hours after. Not the flames themselves, not the smoke that had turned the Montana sky the color of a bruise, but the 40 minutes. The fact that someone had driven past smoke rising above the tree line, had maybe slowed down, had maybe even rolled down a window and smelled the burning pine, and then had driven on. Because it wasn't their problem. Because the mountains did what the mountains did. Because in Cutler Creek, Montana, you kept your head down and your nose out of other people's business. And you had been doing it so long that the instinct had calcified into something that looked almost like wisdom. Mara didn't know any of that yet. She was 12 miles out on Route 9, headlight cutting a pale lane through the dark, the Harley's engine speaking in its low, familiar growl beneath her, the sound that had been the most constant thing in her life for the better part of 2 decades. The night was cold, in the way that Montana nights are cold in late October, which is to say that it was the kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. It came through the leather jacket, through the thermal layer underneath, found the old scar tissue along her left shoulder, and settled in there like a tenant who knew they couldn't be evicted. She'd stopped noticing it most nights. Tonight she noticed it. She had no destination. That was not unusual. She hadn't had a destination in going on 3 years, not since she'd packed everything she was willing to carry into 2 saddlebags and pointed the bike east out of Portland and let the road decide. The road had brought her through Oregon, through Idaho, up into Montana because the summer had been hot, and she'd wanted mountains and silence. Now it was nearly winter, and she was still here, working occasional cash shifts at a garage outside Billings, sleeping in the room above it that the owner, a quiet man named Dutch, had offered without being asked. She paid in labor. He didn't ask questions. It was the best arrangement she'd had in years. She wasn't running from anything specific. That was what she told herself. Running implied there was something close behind you, and Mara Vale was far enough from her past that she couldn't hear it breathing anymore. She was just moving. Moving was different. Moving was just what some people did when staying had cost them too much, too many times, and the accounting had finally come up empty. The smoke hit her before she saw the glow. It came from the northwest, riding the wind down through the pines, and it was thick enough that she registered it as wrong before her brain had finished processing what wrong meant. Not campfire. Not a controlled burn. Something bigger. Something with heat behind it, structural heat, the kind that came from volume and spread rather than a single point source. She slowed the bike without thinking about it, left hand dropping to the throttle, right foot finding the brake with the muscle memory of someone who had been riding since she was 19 years old and had never fully trusted anything that didn't have a kill switch. She pulled onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The silence wasn't silent. That was the thing about mountain forests at night. They breathed. Wind moving through pine boughs, the distant complaint of some bird disturbed from its roost, the low mechanical hum of her own engine cooling. But underneath all of it, underneath the ordinary sounds of a Montana night, she could hear it now. The fire. Not close enough to see yet, but close enough to hear. A low, soft roar, nothing dramatic, nothing like the movie version. Just this steady, patient sound, like an enormous thing exhaling. She sat for a moment, her breath fogged in the cold air. She should call it in. She had a cell phone in her jacket pocket, and she should pull it out and dial the county fire line and give them her location and ride on. That was the correct sequence of events. That was what a person did. She had been many things in her life, some of them considerably worse than the things most people would admit to, and she had paid for most of those things in ways that hadn't involved courts or judges. But she was trying, in the blunt and effortless-looking way that actually cost everything, to be a different arrangement of the same woman. And different arrangements called 911 and rode on. She had the phone out of her pocket and was looking at the screen when she heard it. It was faint. The wind shifted, and for just a second the sound of the fire dropped half a register, and in that gap she heard it, high-pitched, thin, reedy, the unmistakable frequency of a child's voice at maximum distress. Not crying, not whimpering, screaming, full-lunged, desperate, the kind of scream that a child produces when they have stopped hoping that anything is nearby to hear them and are screaming simply because the body will not stop making sound when it is terrified. Mara's hand dropped. The phone went back into her pocket. She had the Harley running again before she had consciously decided anything. She came off the road onto a logging track. No gate, no barrier, just two tire ruts in the dirt that disappeared into the trees. The headlight bounced across roots and rocks, and the low-hanging branches slapped at her helmet, and she didn't slow down. The smoke was thicker here, already stinging, and the glow was visible now above the tree line. Not red and dramatic, but this dirty, flickering orange, low and ground level, the color of something that had been burning long enough to settle into its work. The child screamed again, and this time she had a direction. She took the bike as far as she could, until the track narrowed to nothing and the trees crowded in too tight for the handlebars. She killed the engine and dismounted in one motion, grabbed the small tool roll from the saddlebag out of the habit. There was a switchblade in there, folded shut, and she didn't examine why she reached for it. Some habits were older than thought. The heat hit her when she cleared the tree line. It wasn't the fire she'd imagined from the road. The forest floor was burning, low, spreading, moving through the dry pine duff with a kind of terrible efficiency. Flames may be knee-high in most places, but higher where they found something vertical to climb, and the smoke was dense enough that her eyes were watering immediately. She pulled the collar of her jacket up over her nose and mouth and moved toward the screaming, bent low, keeping below the worst of it. She found Leah Mercer approximately 60 yards into the burning timber. The child was tied to a ponderosa pine at about shoulder height, hands bound behind her around the trunk with what looked like nylon rope, the kind you found in hardware stores and garages, and the beds of pickup trucks. She was 7 years old, though Mara didn't know that yet. She just registered small, very small, the kind of small that recalibrates everything else in your field of vision. Yellow dress, the color almost fluorescent against the smoky dark. Bare feet, because someone had taken her shoes. Ash in her hair, a cut above one eye that had bled down her cheek and dried there. She stopped screaming when she saw Mara. Kids did that sometimes. The shock of an adult appearing where there had been nothing. The sudden confusion of hope where there had been only terror. Her face went completely still for a moment, and in that moment she looked older than she was, and also impossibly young, and Mara moved to her without saying anything because there was nothing useful to say. She had the switchblade open. The rope was cheap but thick, looped twice and knotted in the back, and her hands were not steady. She registered that without judgment, the slight tremor in her fingers a physiological fact. She worked the blade through the first loop, sawing rather than slicing, and the child made a sound against her shoulder, not a scream anymore, more like the sound a person makes when they've been holding a single breath for too long. "Hold still," Mara said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. She hadn't spoken much in the last few days. The second loop parted. Leia's arms came free, and the child collapsed forward against Mara's chest with a force that surprised her. Small arms locked around her neck, and for a second Mara almost lost her balance. She caught herself with one hand against the pine bark and held the child with the other arm and stood up. The fire was moving. She'd spent maybe 90 seconds with the rope. 90 seconds was enough. The ground fire had been 30 yards away when she'd found the girl, and now it was closer, 20 yards maybe, and moving with the wind behind it. The smoke was eye level now, the kind that didn't just sting but suffocated, that replaced oxygen with something that tasted like carbon and char. She could feel the heat on her face, the left side more than the right, the direction the wind was pushing it. She pulled the leather jacket off her shoulders. It took maybe 4 seconds to wrap it around Leia, around her head and shoulders, covering as much of the child's face as she could while still being able to carry her. The jacket was old and heavy, treated with years of oil and road grime, and it smelled like gasoline and cold air and something older beneath that, and it would hold against sparks and embers better than a yellow cotton dress. Mara stood there in just the thermal layer, the cold already biting at her arms where the jacket had been, and she turned toward where she'd left the bike. The tree line she'd come through was gone. Not physically gone. She could still see the trees, dark shapes in the smoke, but the path between here and there had filled with fire while she'd been cutting rope. Low flames, irregular, patchy in places, but enough that she couldn't run a straight line without running through burning ground duff. She adjusted the child's weight against her chest and looked for the gaps. There were gaps. The fire wasn't a wall yet. It was pockets, spreading pockets, and if she moved fast and kept her feet on the rock and dirt rather than the pine needle accumulation, she ran. She didn't think about her boots or the heat through their soles. She didn't think about the child's weight or the route or the smoke that was down to chest level now, the kind of smoke that was more solid than air. She thought about the bike, the specific tree she'd propped it against, the angle of the handlebars. She thought about the gap in the fire 15 yards ahead and to the left. She thought about the switchblade she'd closed and dropped in her pocket without thinking, old muscle memory from years when you didn't leave tools behind. She cleared the burning ground in 6 strides, and the tree line was there, and the bike was there, exactly where she'd left it. Leia had not made a sound during any of this. She had her face buried against Mara's shoulder, and her grip on Mara's neck was the grip of something that intended to remain attached regardless of what happened next. The Harley started on the first try. It always started on the first try. That was the one reliable thing she'd built her nomadic life around, and right now she was grateful for it with the specificity she usually reserved for things that were about to fail. She got the child positioned across her lap. Not safe, not remotely safe by any measurable standard, the child sitting sideways against her with the jacket still wrapped around her and both of Mara's arms forming a cage around her. And she turned the bike around in the narrow track, and she accelerated away from the heat. The fire roared behind them as she hit the logging track. She heard it, the actual sound of the fire consuming the space she had just vacated, the combustion of it, the noise that fire makes when it finally gets what it was reaching for. It sounded like nothing she wanted to think about. She kept her eyes on the track ahead and her hands steady on the bars, and she didn't look back. They came out onto Route 9 40 seconds later, and the cold night air hit her like water. Leia was shaking. It wasn't just the cold. It was the whole body tremor of sustained adrenaline, the aftermath of pure terror, the thing that happens to small bodies when they've run every alarm they have at full volume for longer than they were designed to. Mara felt it through the leather jacket that was still wrapped around her, felt it like a transmission, and she eased the bike to a stop on the shoulder and sat for a moment. "You're out," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, flat and hoarse. "You're out of the fire. You understand me?" The child didn't answer. The shaking continued. Mara sat with that for a moment. She thought about what to do. The correct answer was still the same as it had been before she'd ridden into a burning forest. Call 911, wait for EMS, hand the child to professionals who knew what to do with traumatized children, and walk away. She had no standing here. She had no relationship to this girl, no legal anything, no reason except the one that had nothing to do with reasons. She thought about the rope tied to the tree. Not hastily done, not sloppily done. Deliberately tied, with the knot in the back where a child couldn't reach it, at the height that would leave small hands inaccessible to any reasonable attempt at self-rescue. The fire hadn't started naturally. October in Montana, there hadn't been any lightning, and the burn pattern she'd seen was linear rather than radial, spreading from a point rather than an ignition. Someone had started that fire. And someone had tied this child to a tree first. Those were 2 facts, and the space between them was not ambiguous. She took out her phone and called it in. The fire, the location, the direction of spread. She didn't mention the child. She looked down at the small, still shaking form against her chest, at the ash-gray face and the dried blood on the cheek, and the bare feet that were already white with cold, and she made a decision that she recognized, in some distant part of herself, as the first of several decisions that were going to cost her something. She found the nearest light by memory. There was a diner 3 miles east on Route 9. She'd stopped there twice before, passed it a dozen times. Ruth's place. Yellow neon sign, the R missing its leg so it looked almost like a P, open until 2 in the morning because the owner was an insomniac who had found a way to monetize it. Hot coffee and short-order food, and a corner booth where the light was bad enough that you could mostly disappear. She rode east with the fire behind her. Ruth Harper was 53 years old and had been running her diner alone since her husband walked out 8 years ago, and she had seen enough of the world pass through her door on Route 9 to have stopped being surprised by most of it. She'd served cops and truckers, and a man who later turned out to be on a federal fugitive list, and 3 separate people who had been crying so hard when they sat down that they couldn't read the menu. She'd learned to give people coffee first, and questions never unless they needed something she couldn't guess. But when the door opened at 11:47 and a woman in a thermal layer and ash-covered jeans walked in, carrying a barefoot child wrapped in a leather jacket, even Ruth took a second. "Close the blinds," Mara said. Ruth looked at her. "The window blinds." Mara was already moving toward the corner booth, already scanning the parking lot through the glass before she sat down. "All of them, please." Ruth closed them. She didn't ask why. She was at the booth 30 seconds later with a wet towel and a glass of water, and she crouched down to look at the child without making a production of it. No performance of shock or alarm, just the practical assessment of a woman who had spent her life feeding and not questioning. "She hurt?" "Smoke, cut over the eye, cold. I've got a first aid kit. Bring it." Ruth brought it, and a blanket and a plate of toast that nobody had ordered, and she sat down across from them, and she began quietly cleaning the cut on the child's face, while Mara watched the windows and the child allowed it with the passive exhaustion of someone who had spent all her resources. The toast sat untouched for a while. Then, slowly, Leia's hand moved toward it. That small motion did something to the inside of Mara's chest that she didn't have a name for. Ruth said nothing. She worked. She cleaned and bandaged and wrapped and didn't ask. The diner was otherwise empty. It usually was this late, the peak having been the truck stop crowd around 10:30. The coffee machine hissed softly. A country song played quietly from the kitchen radio, something old and slow, the kind of song that sounded like it had been written in a different country even though it hadn't. Outside in the dark of the parking lot, 2 vehicles sat, Ruth's truck and Mara's Harley. Mara kept looking at the parking lot. "What's your name?" Ruth asked the child. She said it in the tone of someone asking a very small favor. Nothing waited. The child looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Laia." "That's a pretty name, Laia. You warm enough?" A small nod. "You want hot chocolate? I've got the kind with the little marshmallows." Something shifted in the child's face. Not a smile, but the precursor to one. The place where a smile could eventually happen. She nodded again. Ruth went to make it, and Mara and the child were alone in the corner booth with the closed blinds and the old country song and the smell of coffee and fry oil and the specific stillness of late-night places where the rest of the world has temporarily ceased to apply. Laia looked at her. Her eyes were dark and very serious, set in a face that should have been round and soft with childhood, and instead looked like it had been carrying something heavy for longer than faces her age were built to carry. The cut over her eye was bandaged now. The ash was mostly off her hands. She was wrapped in the blanket with the leather jacket across her lap, and she looked, Mara thought, like something that had been through a fire. Because she had been. "He left me there," Laia said. Mara didn't answer. "He tied the rope and he lit the matches, and he left me there." Her voice was flat, not dramatic. The flatness of a child reporting a fact that has not yet fully converted itself into grief, that is still in the phase of being a fact. "He said nobody would find me." "He was wrong," Mara said. "He said it a lot, that nobody would believe me, that nobody would come." She looked down at the leather jacket in her lap. Her small fingers touched the collar. "He said if I told anyone about Mama, that he'd make sure nobody would ever find me." Mama. The word landed in the silence of the diner like a stone in still water, and the rings spread outward, and Mara felt the temperature of the whole situation change. "Where's your mother?" she asked. Laia was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the parking lot. The neon sign buzzed softly in its housing. Ruth came back with the hot chocolate, set it down, and read the room well enough to take herself to the far end of the counter and become very interested in restocking the sugar dispensers. "Mama went away," Laia said. "Victor said she ran off, that she didn't want us anymore." She paused. "But Mama wouldn't do that. She told me things. She hid things. She was scared, but she was trying to fix it." Her voice dropped. "I heard Victor on the phone. He was talking to someone, and he said Mama was gone. But he didn't say gone like she left. He said gone like she stopped. She didn't have the words, or the words existed, but she understood, at whatever level a 7-year-old understands these things, that saying them out loud would make them more real. Mara understood. Victor, she said. What's his last name? Rains. Victor Rains. The name moved through Mara's chest like a current of cold water. Not recognition, not immediate recognition, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a name you've encountered in a context you've been trying to forget. She held it there for a second, held it still, let it be just a name until she could be somewhere quiet enough to follow it back to where she knew it from. She would remember in a minute. She didn't want to remember in front of the child. Okay, she said. You're safe right now, okay? You're in a warm place and no one knows you're here. You know I'm here, Laya said, and looked at her. And the look was not accusation, but it was something. A testing, a reading. The particular wariness of a child who has recently learned that proximity does not equal safety. I know you're here, Mara said, and I'm going to stay here. She said it before she'd decided to say it. It came out of somewhere below the level of conscious decision, below the careful architecture of detachment she had been building for 3 years. Below the walls she'd constructed out of highway miles and cash jobs and rooms above garages. It came out of the place that had heard a child screaming and had turned the bike around without asking permission first. Laya looked at her for another long moment. Then she picked up the hot chocolate and held it in both hands, and said nothing else. And that was more than enough. Ruth came back to the table. I've got a back room, she said to Mara, in a voice pitched low enough that it was for Mara only. Caught in it. I sleep there sometimes when I don't want to drive home late. She can sleep there. Mara nodded. You want to tell me what happened? No. Ruth took that with the equanimity of someone who had spent a decade not asking questions. All right, she said. My cell's behind the counter. You need it. It's there. Your landline. What about it? Does anyone know this number? Regular customers, locals? Ruth's eyes sharpened slightly. She was understanding something. Not everything, but enough. Yes. Don't answer it tonight. A pause. Then Ruth nodded once and went back to the counter, and Mara sat in the corner booth of Ruth's diner on Route 9 with the blinds closed and the child warming both hands around a cup of hot chocolate, and she let the name surface the rest of the way. Victor Rains. She had not heard that name in 7 years. She had not thought about it in maybe 5. Not since the memories had finally started to go quiet. Not since the particular chapter of her life that contained Victor Rains had closed enough that she could stop looking over her shoulder every time she heard boots on gravel. She had ridden with the Iron Compass Motorcycle Club for 11 years. Not as a prospect, not as an associate, as a full-patched member, one of 3 women in the club's history to have earned that without it being a political gesture or a personal favor. She had been many things inside that world. A courier, a negotiator, occasionally a very specific kind of problem solver in situations where the problem was a person who needed to understand something viscerally. She was not proud of all of it. She had paid for most of it in ways that hadn't involved court appearances. Victor Rains had come into the club's orbit 8 years ago through a business arrangement that the club's president, a man named Raymond Bear Calhoun, had later described as the worst decision he'd made in 20 years of leadership. Victor wasn't a biker. He was an adjacent thing, someone with money and connections and the specific charm of a man who had learned to mirror what other people wanted to see in him. He'd provided the club with legitimate business cover, some warehouse space, some paper trails that didn't lead anywhere problematic. In exchange, the club provided him with certain services that he didn't want to have to find elsewhere. Mara had met him 4 times. She had disliked him immediately and completely, with the precise, involuntary dislike that she'd learned over the years to treat as data, rather than judgment. There was something behind his eyes that didn't match the rest of his face. He talked about women in a way that was technically not offensive enough to call out, but that left a residue. He laughed at things that weren't funny and didn't laugh at things that were. He'd been exiled from the club's sphere 7 years ago. She didn't know all the details. She'd already been pulling away from the club by then, already in the long, quiet process of extracting herself from a life that had cost her too much in ways she was only beginning to understand. She'd heard fragments, something he'd done that crossed a line even by the Iron Compass's flexible standards. Bear had cut him off and made it known, in the way that such things were made known in that world, that the association was severed. She had assumed he'd disappeared into whatever dark water men like that disappeared into. She had assumed wrong. Leia's voice, flat and factual, he said gone like gone. Mara looked at the child, who had finished the hot chocolate and was now sitting with her eyes half closed, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. She looked at the closed blinds. She looked at the parking lot through the gap at the edge of the blinds, at her Harley sitting under the cold Montana sky. And she thought about Victor Rains, and she thought about the rope tied to the tree and the fire that somebody had started, and she thought about a woman named Emma Mercer, who may or may not be somewhere in the world tonight. She needed to make a phone call. She didn't want to make it. She took out her cell phone and looked at it for a long moment. The number she needed wasn't in her contacts. She'd deleted the contacts 3 years ago when she'd packed the saddlebags and pointed east. But she still had the number. It was in the same category as her childhood memories of certain important addresses, the kind of information that lives in muscle memory rather than written record, that you can't delete because it was never stored anywhere you have access to. She went to the back of the diner, to the narrow hallway outside the bathroom, where the lighting was a single bulb and the noise from the road outside was muffled to near nothing, and she dialed. It rang 4 times, then, "Who's this?" The voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, measured, the specific timbre of a man who had spent decades making his voice do exactly what he wanted it to do and nothing else. Raymond Calhoun. Bear. It's Mara Vale. A silence. Not a surprise silence. Or maybe it was, but Bear Calhoun's surprises sounded the same as his non-surprises, which was one of the things that had always made him effective and occasionally terrifying. "Haven't heard that name in a while," he said. "I need information." "Hello to you too." "Victor Rains," she said. "Where is he now? What is he doing?" Another silence. This one different, weighted differently, carrying something she couldn't see but could feel through the phone, the way you feel weather changing before you see it. "Where are you?" Bear said. "Montana. Route 9 outside Cutler Creek." "Are you safe?" The question surprised her. Not the content of it, but the speed of it, the way it came before anything else, before any of the obvious follow-up questions about why she was calling after 3 years of silence to ask about Victor Rains. "For now," she said. "Is there a child with you?" Mara's hand tightened on the phone. "Why would you ask that?" "Because Victor Rains has been looking for a child for 6 weeks, Bear said. "And because there's a bounty out for her and for the woman who has her. And because if you're calling me about Victor Rains tonight, then I think you probably already found her." The country music from the kitchen was barely audible from where she stood. The bulb above her head buzzed with the almost inaudible frequency of old fluorescent lights. She stood very still in the narrow hallway of Ruth's diner, and she thought about a child sleeping on a cot in a back room and a rope tied to a tree and a fire that someone had started before walking away. "Tell me everything," she said. Bear told her. He took 17 minutes. Mara listened without interrupting, which was the only way she'd ever been able to listen to Bear. He was not a man who responded well to being interrupted, and more practically, he was the kind of man who delivered information in the correct sequence, and the correct sequence mattered. She held the phone against her ear and watched the narrow hallway while he talked, watching the gap where the hallway met the diner's main room, watching the closed blinds at the front windows. Victor Rains was not simply an exiled former associate of the Iron Compass. He had been for the last 4 years, since before Bear had even known it, which was itself significant, because Bear made it his business to know, a figure in a network that operated primarily in the Mountain West, a network that moved people across state lines through the mechanism of debt and coercion and violence. He had not built it. He was not its architect. But he had inserted himself into it at a level that gave him both income and insulation, the structure above him providing cover, the structure below him providing deniability. Emma Mercer had been his wife for 3 years, or partner. The distinction was apparently contested. "She found something," Bear said. "We don't know exactly what. Paper trail, we think. Something she wasn't supposed to find. She reached out to someone. We don't know who she reached out to. And within 2 weeks, she was gone." "Gone how?" "That's the question." "Victor says she ran." "Victor says a lot of things." "The girl thinks she's dead." "The girl might be right," Bear said. Or she might be somewhere that's worse than dead, which is also a thing that happens in this world. Mara was quiet. He put a bounty on the child because the child heard something, Bear continued. 6 weeks ago. Whatever Emma left behind, if she left anything behind, he thinks the girl knows where it is, or he thinks she's a liability, or both. Men like Victor, they don't stop when they start. Who's holding the bounty? Associates of his. Some of them are people I know by name. Some of them I don't know, which is the part that concerns me more. A pause. Mara, if you've got that child, you need to move. Tonight. Those associates, they find phone traffic, they find patterns. How long have you been at your current location? She looked at her watch. 90 minutes. Then you have time, but not a lot of it. Another pause. Are you alone? Yes. That's going to be a problem. I know. I can send people. I don't want... She stopped. She thought about what she didn't want. She didn't want people from that world near her. She didn't want to owe Bear anything. She didn't want to pull a thread that would unravel the careful reconstruction of the last 3 years, the quiet job above the garage, the roads that led everywhere and nowhere, the deliberate practice of not mattering to anyone who could be used against her. She thought about Leia, about the specific weight of the child against her chest when she'd carried her out of the fire, about the bare feet and the rope at the back of the tree where small hands couldn't reach it. Not yet, she said. Let me move first. Mara, I'll call you when I need them. She hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer. Then she went back to the main room, to the corner booth, and she sat down and she picked up her cold coffee and she looked at the blinds and she thought. Ruth appeared at the table. She had a look on her face that was not panic but was adjacent to it, the controlled alertness of a woman who was beginning to understand that she was in something larger than she'd signed up for. There's a truck, Ruth said quietly. It came in about 10 minutes ago. Hasn't ordered anything, sitting in the parking lot with its lights off. Mara set down the coffee. Does it look like a regular customer? Ruth's expression said everything. No. Mara looked at the back wall, the door to the back room, the window above the utility sink that opened onto the alley behind the diner. She calculated weight, angles, the amount of time it would take a person to come through the front door and cross the room versus the amount of time it would take to go out the back window. She stood up. Wake her, she said to Ruth, quietly. Get her coat if you have something that'll fit. Tell her not to make any noise. Ruth went. Mara moved to the edge of the nearest blind and lifted it a 1/4 inch with one finger. The truck was still there, a dark pickup, full size, no plates she could read from here. The dome light was off. She could see the silhouette of a person in the driver's seat, and the silhouette was not moving, and the stillness of it was worse than movement would have been. One person in the truck. Maybe more she couldn't see. The parking lot had 2 exits, one onto Route 9, one onto the service road behind the property. Her Harley was at the front. The front was where the truck was. She heard Ruth come back with Leia, the child's bare feet silent on the linoleum. She turned around. Leia was awake and looked at her with those serious dark eyes, and whatever she saw in Mara's face she read correctly because she didn't ask any questions. She just nodded once, and the nod was the most adult thing Mara had seen in a long time. Ruth pressed a set of keys into Mara's hand. My truck, she said. The service road takes you back to the highway 2 miles east. Don't go west. She paused. Victor Rains, that's the name. It wasn't a question. It was a recognition. Mara looked at her. His people came through here once before, Ruth said very quietly. Last spring. They didn't find what they were looking for, but they made themselves clear about what would happen to anyone who talked. She met Mara's eyes with the steady gaze of a woman who had chosen a long time ago to be someone who didn't flinch. You take care of that girl. Mara pocketed the keys. She looked at Leia, who was standing in the middle of Ruth's diner in a too large borrowed jacket with bare feet and dark eyes, and the expression of a child who had already learned tonight that the world would set her on fire and leave her tied to a tree. The person in the truck outside hadn't moved, but the back of Mara's neck told her, with the particular certainty of a nervous system that had been trained over years in difficult situations, that this was not going to stay simple for much longer. She picked up the child. We're going out the back, she said. What Victor Rains was about to find out was that Mara Vale had not been running from her past. She'd been waiting for a reason to turn around. Ruth's truck smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee, and the specific sadness of a vehicle that had been used for practical things for a long time without complaint. The heater worked, which was the only thing that mattered. Mara had the engine running before she'd finished closing the door, and she took the service road east with the headlights off for the first quarter mile, navigating by the ambient glow of the sky and the pale ribbon of gravel visible through the windshield, because the person in the dark pickup out front did not need to know which direction they'd gone until they were already gone. Laya sat in the passenger seat with her knees pulled to her chest and the borrowed jacket wrapped around her like a shell. She had not asked where they were going. She had not asked anything. She watched the dark trees move past the window with those serious eyes, and she breathed steadily, which was more than Mara had expected. Mara turned the headlights on when she hit the paved surface of Route 9 East. In the rearview mirror, Ruth's diner shrank to a yellow smear of neon and then disappeared behind a curve. No headlights followed them. Not yet. She drove. The radio was tuned to a country station that was mostly static this far from any transmitter, and she left it because the static was better than the silence. Leia's breathing was the other sound in the cab, slow and increasingly regular, the body finally beginning its descent from crisis. Mara watched the road and thought about Bear's voice on the phone and the weight of 17 minutes of information she hadn't finished processing yet. They were 40 miles east of Cutler Creek before Leia spoke. "Where are we going?" "East for now," Mara said. "Then we'll decide." "Are you taking me to the police?" A direct question from a 7-year-old who had been tied to a tree by her stepfather 4 hours ago. Mara thought about how to answer it honestly without explaining everything that was wrong with that option. "Not yet," she said. Leia absorbed this. Then, "Victor knows people in the police." "How do you know that?" "Heard him talking." A pause. "He talks on the phone a lot when he thinks I'm asleep. Mama used to say that loud voices think quiet rooms are empty." Mara looked at the road. A dead woman's proverb delivered through a child's mouth at midnight in a borrowed truck. She felt something shift in her chest. Some piece of whatever armor she'd been building for 3 years settling differently against its foundation. "Your mama sounds smart," she said. "She is smart," Leia said. Present tense, deliberate, defiant present tense. "She's the smartest person I know." Neither of them said anything for a while after that. Mara found a motel outside a town called Harker's Pass at close to 2 in the morning. The kind of motel that had been built in the 1970s and renovated twice, badly, and still had a vacancy sign that used incandescent bulbs. She paid cash at the window, gave a name that wasn't hers, took a room at the far end of the ground floor with a view of the parking lot and an emergency exit 20 feet from the door. She got Leia inside and onto one of the twin beds, and the child was asleep in minutes, fully clothed, on top of the covers, the borrowed jacket still on because Mara didn't want to wake her by removing it. She covered her with the bedspread and stood there for a moment in the dark room looking at the shape of the child in the bed and thinking about how this had happened, how she had crossed from the shoulder of Route 9 into this thing in the span of approximately 5 hours. She didn't think about it long. Thinking about how you ended up somewhere was less useful than thinking about what you did now that you were there. She pulled the only chair in the room to face the door, and she sat down and she did not sleep. She called Bear at 4:30 in the morning when the window above the bathroom sink had shifted from black to the color of old charcoal. "Still moving?" he said. He sounded awake. She had never known Bear to sound anything other than awake. "Harker's Pass Motel, off Route 9 East." "How far from Cutler Creek?" 40 miles. "Not far enough." A pause that had texture in it, the sound of a man deciding something. "I'm sending Creed." Mara's jaw tightened. "I said not yet. You said when you needed them. You need them now, Mara. You're alone on a highway with a child that has a bounty on her head, in a truck that belongs to a woman Victor's people are probably already interviewing, and you've been awake for—" He stopped. "How long have you been awake?" She didn't answer. "Creed knows this territory," Bear said. "He grew up in eastern Montana. He knows every road between Cutler Creek and the Wyoming border. He's been out of the life for 4 years, same as you. He's clean." "Nobody's clean." "Then he's cleaner than the alternative. He'll find you by morning." Another pause. "I'm not asking your permission, Mara. I'm telling you what I'm doing because you're owed that much. He's already writing." She wanted to argue. She sat with the desire for a moment, examined it, recognized it for what it was, not strategy, Not practicality, just the reflexive resistance of someone who had spent 3 years learning to need nothing and was now in the process of discovering how much that learning was going to cost her tonight. "Tell him yellow door," she said. "Far end of the lot." "He'll find it." She hung up. Outside, the sky was lightening in the east. The parking lot was empty except for 2 other vehicles, both of which she'd already assessed. A minivan with out-of-state plates and a sedan with a cracked bumper that hadn't moved since before she'd checked in. She watched them through the window for another hour. Nothing moved. She heard the bike before she saw it. It came in off the highway around 6:15, and the sound of the engine was the specific sound of a Harley-Davidson Softail running cold in the morning air, the exhaust note a little rough before it warmed up, the kind of rough that wasn't a mechanical problem but a temperature problem, the bike telling you about the weather rather than about itself. She had the curtain moved an inch before the headlight swept the parking lot. He was bigger than she remembered. Bear's people tended to run large, see. It was partly selection, partly the kind of life that added mass to a person, the way weather added to stone. But Creed had always been on the larger end even for that company. 6'4", maybe 230, broad through the shoulders in a way that wasn't gym muscle, but the kind of density that came from physical work over decades. He had a beard that had gone mostly gray since she'd last seen him, and a face that had a few more lines in it and the same quality he'd always had, which was the quality of a man who was always slightly more alert than the room he was in. He pulled up to the yellow door and killed the engine and sat on the bike for a moment before dismounting, which was Creed's way. He didn't move until he'd looked at everything worth looking at. She knew because she'd ridden with him for 3 years. Knew his habits the way you knew the habits of people who had been in difficult situations with you, the kind of knowing that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with survival. She didn't know how she felt about seeing him. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning was cold and gray, and the parking lot smelled like exhaust and frost. "You look like hell," he said. "You drove all night," she said. "How do you look?" He almost smiled, almost. "Bear send you my regards?" "Bear sent you." "Same thing." He looked past her into the room, at the child-shaped lump under the bedspread. "That her?" "Yes." "She hurt?" "Smoke inhalation cut over the eye. She'll be fine." A pause. "Come in." He came in and she closed the door, and they stood in the narrow space between the beds and the dresser, the room too small for both of them without an awareness of it, and she looked at him properly for the first time in 3 years, and he looked back at her with the particular steadiness that had always been his default state. 3 years, he said. 4, almost. "You didn't call." "I didn't call anyone." "I know." He looked at the child again. Something moved behind his eyes, not sentimentality, not the performed softness that people put on around children. Something older and quieter. "Bear told me about the fire." "Bear knows more than I told him." "Bear always knows more." He moved to the window, did the same assessment she'd been doing all night, parking lot, sight lines, exit routes. "What do you know about Victor Rains?" "What Bear told me, what the girl told me." "The girl tell you about her mother?" "She thinks her mother might be dead." Creed turned from the window. "She's not." The room was very quiet for a moment. The heater clicked softly. In the bed, Leia stirred but didn't wake. "How do you know that?" Mara said. "Because 3 weeks ago, a woman named Emma Mercer made contact with a man named Daley Worth, who runs a safe house network out of eastern Idaho. She was alive and injured and carrying a copy drive with enough financial documentation on Victor's network to take down 12 people above him and 37 people below him. She gave Daley the drive, and she told him she needed time to get back to her daughter." He paused. "She didn't make it back. Victor's people found Daley's operation. We don't know if Emma got out." Mara stared at him. "You've been tracking this," she said. "Bear has." "Why?" Creed's expression shifted minimally. Not evasion, but the face of a man preparing to say something he'd been sitting with. Because when Victor was exiled from the club's orbit, he didn't just disappear. He made statements to specific people about what he intended to do to the people he blamed for his exile. A beat. "You were on that list, Mara. You were first on it." The heater clicked again. Outside, a truck passed on the highway. Doppler shifting from high to low and gone. You should have told me, she said. You weren't reachable. You should have found a way. His jaw set. I know. They stood in the small room with that between them, the specific weight of it. 3 years of her believing she'd walked away clean from something that had apparently been following her at a distance the entire time, like a shadow that lengthened as the light changed but didn't disappear. The copy drive, she said. If Emma gave it to Daly, and Daly's operation got hit, the drive might be gone, or Victor might have it, or it might still be in play somewhere. He looked at the child. But Victor doesn't know which, and he thinks the girl knows something. That's why the bounty isn't just about eliminating a liability. He thinks she's a key. Leia's voice came from the bed. She hid things. Both of them turned. The child was awake, lying on her back, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Her voice was calm and clear in the way that voices were sometimes calm after the body had finally been allowed to sleep. Mama hid things, Leia said again. She turned her head and looked at them both with those dark, serious eyes. She told me, before she went away. She said if something ever happened to her, she left things for me, things that would explain everything. She said I'd know where to find them because she showed me the secret. Mara sat down slowly on the edge of the other bed. What secret? She said. Leia sat up. She reached inside the collar of her borrowed jacket and pulled out a chain, thin, silver, the kind you found in jewelry stores that catered to children, cheap but carefully chosen. On the end of it was a locket, small and oval-shaped, stamped with a simple flower on the cover. She gave me this the last time I saw her, Leia said. She said if I ever needed to find her, I should follow the hidden light. And she made me say it back 3 times until I had it. Follow the hidden light. Mara looked at Creed. He was looking at the locket. May I see it? Mara said. Leia handed it over without hesitation. And the trust in that gesture, the simple extension of the chain across the space between them, the absolute lack of calculation in it, hit Mara somewhere below the sternum. The locket opened with a thumbnail. Inside, a small photograph on one side, a woman and a child. The woman dark-haired and luminous and clearly Leia's mother, the child unmistakably Leia, both of them laughing at something off-frame. On the other side, scratched into the metal itself with something sharp, a series of marks. Not letters, not numbers, something that looked almost like a map or a diagram or a series of reference points reduced to their essential lines. What does this mean? Creed said, looking over her shoulder. I don't know yet, Mara said. She looked at Leia. Do you know what these marks mean? Leia looked at the inside of the locket for a long moment. Then she looked up. The lighthouse, she said. Mama took me there once, when I was really little. She said it was her secret place. She said it was where she went when she needed to feel brave. Where's the lighthouse? I don't know the exact place, but Mama said it was near the ocean. She said you could hear the water from the road. Oregon coast. The phrase surfaced in Mara's mind with the specificity of something she'd heard before in a relevant context. She looked at Creed. He nodded slowly. There are abandoned light stations on the Oregon coast. Several of them. Some have been decommissioned for 30, 40 years. Victor know about this place? Unknown. If Emma sent the copy drive with Daly, and if there's a backup, it would be at the lighthouse, Creed said. If Emma was smart enough to hide the primary with Daly and keep a backup in a place only her daughter could find. He paused. She was smart enough. From what we know about her, she was very smart. Mara looked at the map scratched into the silver of the locket. She looked at the woman in the photograph, laughing, alive. She thought about present tense. She is smart. She is the smartest person I know. She handed the locket back to Leia. Keep this safe, she said. Don't take it off. Leia put the chain back around her neck. Outside, in the growing morning, the highway was filling with the early traffic of people who had no idea what was happening in a motel room at the edge of Harker's Pass, Montana. Truckers, commuters, people driving to jobs and grocery stores and school drop-offs. The entire ordinary machinery of a world that moved forward without requiring any of its participants to know what was happening 3 feet off the road. Mara stood up. She needed coffee and a map and a conversation she didn't want to have, and she was going to have all 3. I need to call Bear, she said. He'll want to send more people, Creed said. I know. You're going to fight him on it. I'm going to think about whether to fight him on it, she said. There's a difference. Creed's expression said he found the distinction marginal. He didn't say so out loud, which was one of the things she had always appreciated about him, and also, occasionally, one of the things that made him difficult. He had a way of communicating disagreement through the specific quality of his silence that was harder to dismiss than argument would have been. She stepped outside with the phone. The morning was sharp, the sky the color of old pewter, the parking lot surface glazed with a thin film of frost that hadn't melted yet. Her breath fogged. She dialed Bear's number and listened to the single ring before he picked up. She's alive, she said. Emma Mercer is alive, or was alive 3 weeks ago. She made contact with a man named Daley Worth in eastern Idaho. Gave him a copy drive. Did you know this? A pause. We knew about Daley's network being hit. We didn't know what was on the drive. The child has a locket. Her mother left her a map, rough, etched into the metal. There's an abandoned lighthouse on the Oregon coast that Emma used. Mara thinks there's a backup copy of whatever documentation Emma collected. The primary might be compromised. She stopped herself. Creed told me about the list, Victor's list, that I was on it. Silence on Bear's end. You should have found a way to tell me, she said. 3 years, Bear. You were gone, Bear said. You made it clear you were gone. I wasn't going to reach into your new life with that kind of information. And what? Give me the option of deciding for myself? Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't level. Something that had been building since 4:30 in the morning when she'd sat in a motel chair listening to a child sleep and beginning to understand the shape of what she'd walked into. I've been riding alone for 3 years thinking I was free and clear, and you knew the whole time that I had a target on me. I was handling it. Were you? Another silence. Then, quietly, no, not well enough. She stood in the cold parking lot and let out a slow breath. The frost on the asphalt glittered faintly in the morning light, catching it and giving it back in small cold points. She thought about 11 years of writing for the Iron Compass, about Bear's voice, always measured, always 3 steps ahead of the room, about all the things that had been handled and all the things that had slipped through the handling. We're going to Oregon, she said. There are people between Montana and Oregon who are looking for that child. Victor's people moved fast after the fire. A pause. There were 2 men at Ruth Harper's diner by 3 this morning. She's all right. She told them nothing. But her truck is burned now as a lead because they'll know she helped you. Ruth. Mara thought about the woman closing blinds without asking why. You take care of that girl. We need a different route, Mara said. Creed knows the routes, Bear said. Let him help you. He's already helping. There are others I want to send. Not yet. She looked at the yellow door at the far end of the motel. We move today. If we need more people, I'll call before we hit the Idaho border. Mara. Bear's voice shifted fractionally, became something slightly different. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate. The voice of a man choosing his words with the kind of care that meant the words mattered. I know what you're doing. I know why you're doing it the way you're doing it. But this isn't about being alone anymore. That child changes the math. She didn't respond. She changes everything, Bear said. You know that. She hung up. She stood for a moment longer in the cold. Then she went back inside. Creed had made coffee with the small in-room machine, the kind of coffee that was technically coffee in the same way that a convenience store map was technically a map. But it was hot, and it existed, and she took the cup he held out without comment. Leia was sitting up on the bed, eating crackers from a vending machine bag, a box of orange juice beside her, both of which Creed had apparently acquired while Mara was on the phone. Mara looked at the crackers, then at Creed. She didn't ask when he'd gotten them. We should move before noon, he said. Earlier. Victor's people were at the diner by 3. They know we went east. She sat down, drank the bad coffee, thought about the route. If we go south before we go west, we can pick up the interstate below the state line and approach Oregon from below. Adds 4 hours. I know, he nodded. I know a place we can stop. Halfway. Not a public place. Old contact of mine runs a farm property outside Dillon. Clean. Not connected to any of this. Who is he? Name's Garrett. We rode together for 2 years about 15 years ago. He left the life completely. Different reasons. He doesn't owe me anything, but he'll help." Mara looked at him. Creed met her eyes without deflection, and she read him the way she'd always been able to read him, which was the way you read people you'd been in tight situations with. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough to know the difference between the truth and the version of the truth they were presenting. "Okay," she said. They packed what little there was to pack. Mostly nothing, the emergency minimalism of people who were moving rather than staying. Leia ate her crackers and watched them with careful attention, tracking their movements and their faces the way a child tracked adults. When the adults were clearly managing something serious, and the child was deciding whether to insert themselves into it, she inserted herself. "Are you two married?" she asked. Creed choked on his coffee. Mara did not react visibly, which cost her something. "No," Mara said. "Were you?" "No." "You act like it," Leia said, not unkindly, simply observationally, with the flat accuracy of a child who had been watching adults navigate around each other for long enough to recognize the pattern. "You argue like married people." Creed set his cup down and found something outside the window to look at. His ears were slightly red. Mara noted this with the part of her brain that cataloged things without necessarily knowing what to do with them, and said nothing. They were on the road by 7:45. Creed led on the Harley, and Mara followed in Ruth's truck with Leia, because the child needed to be in something enclosed and heated, and because putting Leia on the back of a motorcycle on a November morning in Montana was not something Mara was willing to do, regardless of how practical it might theoretically be. The caravan was a concession to visibility. 2 vehicles were easier to track than 1, but the alternative was worse. She kept Creed's taillight in sight and watched the mirrors. For the first 2 hours, nothing followed. Outside Dillon, the land opened up into high grassland, the mountains stepping back, the sky expanding to the enormous gray canvas of the Montana plains. The road was mostly empty at this hour on a weekday. She watched the mirrors and thought about Victor Rains and thought about a copy drive in an Idaho safe house that might or might not still exist, and she thought about the scratches inside the locket and what a woman named Emma Mercer had done, had been smart enough and desperate enough to do, when she'd realized she was in a situation that was going to go wrong before it went right. Leia had fallen asleep against the window again. The borrowed jacket was pulled up to her chin. The chain of the locket was just visible above the collar. Mara looked at the sleeping child and then looked back at the road. She thought, "I have no plan beyond the next 12 hours. She thought, "That has been true for 3 years, and most of those hours turned out fine." She thought, "This is different." Garrett's property was outside Dillon proper, down a dirt road that had once been maintained and was now maintained only by the memory of maintenance, the kind of road that needed a pickup or a truck to navigate without bottoming out, which was probably intentional. The farmhouse was visible from the road. 2 stories, painted white once, painted gray by weather since, a working property that worked at its own pace without apology. Smoke came from the chimney. 2 dogs that were part shepherd and part something more interesting came to investigate as Mara pulled in behind Creed. The man who came to the door was in his mid-50s, stocky, with the kind of hands that spoke to decades of outdoor physical labor, enlarged knuckles, calloused palms. The particular build of a man who had been strong for a long time and intended to continue. He had a full beard shot through with gray and eyes that were the specific shade of pale blue that sometimes read as cold from a distance, and weren't, up close, anything like cold. He looked at Creed. "You look old," Garrett said. "You look older," Creed said. They shook hands with the grip of men who had been in the same difficult places at the same difficult times, and no further ceremony was exchanged. Garrett looked at Mara and then at the child standing beside Mara's leg, and something crossed his face, not surprise, but the recognition of a situation, the specific acknowledgement of what was actually happening here. "Come in," he said. "I've got food." The inside of the farmhouse was warm and smelled like coffee and wood smoke and hay tracked in from outside, and there was a dog asleep in front of the fireplace that was not part shepherd and part something more interesting, but was instead entirely large and brown and disinclined to move for guests. Leia looked at the dog. The dog opened one eye and looked at Leia. Leia crossed the room and sat down next to the dog. Garrett watched this. He said nothing. He went to the kitchen and came back with plates of eggs and toast and more coffee. And the three adults sat around the table, and Leia sat against the fireplace with the large brown dog, and the domestic machinery of the farmhouse moved around them like weather, unhurried and indifferent to the weight they'd brought through the door. "Bear called," Garrett said, after they'd eaten. He addressed this to the middle of the table, to no one in particular, which was a technique Mara recognized, giving everyone the same amount of warning, giving no one the chance to feel blindsided. Creed looked at Mara. Mara looked at Garrett. "When?" she said. "Hour ago. Said you'd be coming. Said you'd be resistant to what I was about to tell you." "Tell me anyway." Garrett set down his coffee cup. He folded his hands on the table in the way of a man who had sat at enough tables with enough complicated conversations to know that the posture of it mattered. "Two of Victor's men are 40 miles behind you," he said. "They picked up the truck description from a gas station camera outside Harker's Pass. They lost you south of Dillon, but they're working the roads." A pause. "And there are two more that Bear's people located in Portland. He thinks they're staging to cover the Oregon approaches. Victor knows you're heading west." Mara said nothing. "He doesn't know about the lighthouse specifically," Garrett continued, "but he knows the coast, apparently. Emma grew up there. He's covering it as a possibility." He looked at her steadily. "Bear wants to send 4 more riders, people he trusts, to run interference between here and the Oregon border and to cover the coast approach." "Interference," Mara said. That's the word he used. Creed was watching her. She could feel it without looking at him. That quality of his attention, the specific texture of it when he was reading her rather than just looking at her. "If Bear sends 4 riders and they run interference with Victor's people," she said, "then this stops being a quiet extraction and becomes a visible conflict." "It's already a visible conflict," Garrett said. "Victor made it that when he tied a child to a tree. Bear sending people is an iron compass action," she said. "Even if the riders are technically out, that becomes a statement about the club. That becomes retaliation. Victor will escalate." "Victor is already escalating," Creed said, quietly. "He has people in Portland. He's covering the coast. He knows what the lighthouse might mean because he knows enough about Emma to know she had a place she went to. He's not waiting for us to figure this out. He's already 3 moves into the next part of this." Mara looked at the table. She thought about the list, Victor's list, first on it. She thought about Bear's voice, measured and deliberate. "I was handling it." And then, "No, not well enough." She thought about 11 years of writing inside a structure that had kept her alive and cost her nearly everything else, and about the 3 years she'd spent trying to understand what she'd traded and whether it was possible to recalibrate without losing what she'd gotten in the exchange. She looked up at Garrett. "You're out of the life." "Completely," he said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "Then why are you doing this?" He looked at her for a moment with those pale blue eyes that weren't cold, up close. "Because Bear asked me," he said. "And because a child tied to a tree in a burning forest is a thing that you don't walk past, even if you're out of the life." He paused. "Some things don't require a reason beyond the thing itself." The dog by the fireplace had allowed Leia to lean against its flank. The child's eyes were half closed again. The accumulated exhaustion of a sleepless night and a burning forest, and the back of a truck and a motel room settling into her with the particular gravity of a body that had finally reached a place warm enough to let it. Mara watched her. She thought about Bear's voice. She changes everything. She thought, he's right. She thought, I've known he's right since I cut the rope. "Call Bear," she said. "Tell him to send the riders." She said it to the table, to the middle of it, to no one, and everyone the way Garrett had. "But I need them running the routes between here and the border, not escorting us. I need Victor's people occupied and misdirected, not confronted. Not yet. If it comes to confrontation, it needs to happen at a time and place that I control, not on a highway with a child in the vehicle." Creed nodded once. "And tell him I want to know everything about the lighthouse," she said. "Exact location, access roads, any recent activity in that area, any indication that Victor's people have already been there." She paused. "And I want to know the last confirmed location of Emma Mercer." Garrett was already reaching for his phone. She looked at Creed. "How far to the Oregon border from here?" 8 hours, good conditions. "We leave in 2 hours. Leia needs sleep." She stood. "And I need to think." She went outside. The morning had settled into something cold and still, the kind of stillness that felt deliberate. The mountains far to the north, a dark line against the sky. She stood in Garrett's yard with her hands in her pockets, and she looked at the road that had brought her here and the road that would take her west, and she thought about all the ways this could go wrong, and then she stopped thinking about that because it wasn't useful. She thought instead about the locket, about the marks etched into the silver, about a woman in a photograph, laughing, alive, present tense. If Creed was right, if the 3-week-old information still held, if Victor's people hadn't found her in the time between. She thought about what Emma Mercer had been willing to do, had been smart enough and brave enough to do. Leave a copy drive with a stranger, etch a map into her daughter's locket, fake her own disappearance, endure whatever she'd endured in the weeks since, all to get evidence to the surface, all to build a case strong enough that Victor's network couldn't be quietly made to disappear. Mara thought, she wasn't just trying to survive, she was trying to end it. She thought, that's the kind of thing that gets you killed. She thought, or the kind of thing that requires someone else to finish what you started. The dogs came and sat beside her in the cold yard, the shepherd mix pair, both of them pressing their sides against her legs with the uncomplicated warmth of animals that had no stake in any of the larger architecture and simply recognized a person standing still in the cold who might benefit from company. She stood with the dogs in the cold and the quiet, and she didn't move for a while. When she went back inside, Creed was on the phone in the corner of the main room, speaking low and direct, and Garrett was cleaning up the breakfast dishes with the methodical efficiency of a man who found order in the physical, and Leia was fully asleep against the big brown dog, the locket chain just visible at her collar, her breathing slow and even and utterly unguarded. Creed finished his call and came to stand beside her. 4 riders, he said, 2 heading east from Bear's current location, 2 coming up from the south. They'll be positioned between here and the Idaho border by tonight. Bear say anything else? He said the last confirmed location of Emma Mercer was a clinic outside a town called Mineral in southwest Idaho. A pause. 3 weeks ago. She left voluntarily. She told the clinic staff she had somewhere she needed to be. The lighthouse. Mara looked at the sleeping child. She was heading for the coast, Mara said. That's what Bear thinks. Victor's people in Portland, are they watching the coastal highways? Both of the main approaches from the north, but there's a third route. He moved to the table and picked up an old paper road atlas that Garrett had left there. Actual paper, which was a thing that people who'd spent time in territories with no cell service still kept around. He opened it to Oregon and pointed. Coastal Road 12. It's older, goes inland through timber country before it hits the coast. Takes longer. Not the kind of route someone in a hurry would take. Which means Victor's people won't be watching it. Probably not. She looked at the map. The coastal line of Oregon, the highway running inland through forest and then out to the water. The specific quality of that coast. She'd been there twice, years ago, and she remembered it. Rocky and gray and enormous, the kind of landscape that put things in proportion. We'll take Route 12, she said. She looked up from the map and found Creed looking at her, and the look on his face was one she recognized but hadn't seen in 3 years. The particular expression of a man who was with her, not ahead, not behind, but with her, and the recognition of it did something complicated in her chest. You know this might not end quietly, he said, even with the riders, even with the routes. I know. Victor doesn't let go of things. You know that better than most. I know. This goes all the way to the lighthouse, and if Emma's there, and if there's evidence... He stopped. Victor will come. He'll come himself. She looked at him for a long moment. Good, she said. He held her gaze, then, okay, no argument, no qualification. Just the word, flat and solid, and the thing it carried underneath it. The weight of a man who had ridden next to her for 3 years in another life, and had known her well enough then and now to know that the moment she said good about Victor Raines coming for her personally was the moment the situation had shifted from extraction to something else. Something she had been moving toward since the moment she'd heard a child screaming in a burning forest and turned the bike around. It was Garrett's voice from the kitchen that broke it. You should know, he said, and stopped. Mara looked at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his phone in his hand, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man reading something that had changed the shape of what he thought he knew. What? She said. He looked up from the phone. Bear got a location on Ruth Harper's diner, he said. Victor's people went back. Mara went still. Ruth's okay, Garrett said quickly. She's out. Her neighbor got her out. But the diner... He stopped again. He looked down at the phone and then back up at Mara, and the specific quality of what he was communicating in the silence between the words landed like something physical. Victor's people burned it down. The kitchen was very quiet. Mara thought about a woman who closed blinds without asking why, who pressed keys into her hand and said, "You take care of that girl," who stood in her own diner and named Victor Rains with the voice of someone who had been visited by his people once before and had chosen not to flinch and had kept right on choosing. The diner Ruth Harper had built and run alone for 8 years. The yellow neon sign with the broken R. The corner booth where the light was bad enough to disappear. Gone. Because Mara had been there. Because Laya had been there. Because Victor Rains did not make threats as threats. He made them as demonstrations. She looked at the child asleep against the dog by the fireplace. She looked at Creed, and she understood, with the clean and total clarity of something that had been approaching for hours and had finally arrived, that this was no longer a situation she could navigate quietly or alone, or with the careful minimalism of a woman trying to cost as little as possible. Victor had just made it personal in a direction that had nothing to do with her. He'd made it about Ruth, about an ordinary woman who had made coffee and asked no questions and trusted a stranger to do the right thing. He'd made it about every person in the radius of this, every person connected by the loosest thread of proximity to Leah Mercer and the locket around her neck and the evidence her mother had hidden at the end of a coastal road. Mara Vale picked up her phone. She called Bear. He answered on the first ring. "Send them all," she said. They left Garrett's farm at 9:40 in the morning under a sky the color of old pewter, low and moving, the kind of sky that wasn't deciding between snow and rain, but had simply committed to both. Mara drove. Creed rode ahead. Leah sat in the passenger seat with the locket held in her closed fist rather than around her neck, the way a person held something they were afraid of losing. Not worn, but gripped, the chain looped through her fingers. She hadn't said anything since waking. She'd eaten half a piece of toast at Garrett's table, had let Garrett's wife, a quiet woman named Sarah, who had appeared from somewhere in the back of the house and had not asked a single question, wash her face and find her a pair of socks that were 3 sizes too large and fold them down at the ankles so they'd stay on. Small kindnesses, the kind that didn't announce themselves. They were 2 hours into the drive, somewhere in the empty corridor between Dillon and the Idaho border, when Creed's brake light flashed 3 times in quick succession. Not a mechanical problem, a signal. They'd developed it years ago. 3 flashes meant pull off. Now, no discussion. Mara pulled off. The shoulder was gravel and sparse brown grass. The highway empty in both directions. Nothing visible for miles except the road and the land and the enormous gray sky pressing down on all of it. Creed had already killed the Harley and was standing beside it with his phone to his ear by the time she rolled to a stop behind him. His back was to her. His shoulders were set in a way she recognized. She told Leah to stay in the truck. She got out. The cold hit immediately. Not the casual cold of morning, but the serious cold of a front moving through, wind carrying temperature from somewhere north and not apologizing for it. She crossed to Creed and stood beside him and waited. He was listening, not talking, and the listening went on for 45 seconds, which was long enough that she started reading his body language instead. Jaw tight, the hand not holding the phone pressed flat against his thigh. Not a fist, but controlled, the deliberate not making of one. He lowered the phone. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood facing the road for a moment, and that moment told her more than whatever he was about to say, because Creed did not have moments unless what was coming required one. He turned. "Bears riders," he said. "The 2 coming up from the south. What about them?" "They were hit outside Salmon City 2 hours ago. Both bikes off the road. One rider's in a hospital." A pause. "The other one isn't." The wind moved between them. "Victor's people," she said. "No." He held her gaze. "That's the problem." Bear pulled the camera footage from the rest stop where they were last seen. The vehicle that followed them out. It wasn't Victor's people. Wrong plates, wrong vehicle profile, wrong operational pattern. He stopped. It was law enforcement, federal plates. She stared at him. Bear thinks someone inside the investigation, someone with access to federal traffic monitoring, someone who knew our riders were moving, called it in. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man delivering information that he was still processing himself. Victor has someone inside, not local, federal. The road was empty, the sky was pressing down. Somewhere north of them, invisible behind clouds, the mountains existed. How deep, she said. Unknown. The riders from the east? Bear pulled them back. A beat. Mara, if Victor has federal access, then the routes we mapped, the phones we used at Garrett's farm, the call you made to Bear this morning? She was already moving back to the truck. She pulled open the driver's door, reached under the dashboard, disconnected the GPS transponder that Ruth's truck might or might not have had. She'd checked for it earlier and hadn't found one, but now she looked again, properly, running her hand along the underside of the dash, behind the rear view column, under the seat. Nothing. She got out and stood in the cold wind and looked at her own cell phone. She turned it off. She looked at Creed. He was already holding his phone over the ditch at the roadside. He looked at her once. She nodded. He dropped it. They looked at each other. The lighthouse, she said. If Victor has federal access, he can pull traffic cameras on every coastal approach. Route 12 isn't covered. You said it yourself. I said probably not. He held her gaze. That was before I knew about the federal component. She thought about the locket in Laya's fist, about Emma Mercer scratching a map into silver with something sharp in a moment when she'd understood that the official channels were not available to her. Not paranoia. Information. Emma had known, had understood something that Mara was only now catching up to, that the thing she was carrying was big enough to have reached into the systems that were supposed to stop it. She looked back at the truck. Through the windshield, Leia was watching her, dark eyes. Steady. She thought, Emma Mercer built her escape route assuming she couldn't trust the official world. She was right. She was right the whole time. She went back to the truck. She opened the passenger door and crouched down to eye level with Leia, the cold wind pushing at her back. The locket, she said. The marks inside. Can you draw them from memory if I give you paper? Leia looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. I've looked at them a lot. I need you to do that, right now. She turned to Creed. Garrett had that road atlas. It's in the truck, he said. He reached past her into the back seat and produced it. Actual paper, which was now the most valuable thing in the vehicle. He tore a page from the back, handed it to Leia with a pen from his jacket pocket. Leia took them. She opened her fist and looked at the locket for a moment, not to copy it, but to compare, to verify. And then she drew. Quickly, with the focused certainty of a child reproducing something she'd memorized. 4 marks, each one a simple line or angle, arranged in a specific relationship to each other. She handed the paper back. Mara and Creed looked at it. It was a compass arrangement, so not a standard compass rose, but a relative one. A primary direction mark, 2 secondary reference points, and a distance indicator that was abstract rather than specific. The kind of thing that was meaningless without standing in the right place first, and perfectly clear once you were. She'd know the starting point, Creed said quietly. The lighthouse station, Mara said. If we're standing at the lighthouse, these marks become a direction and a distance. She looked at him. Emma designed it so that anyone who found the locket without Leia couldn't use it. But Leia, standing at the lighthouse, with this in her hand, could walk directly to whatever Emma left. Mara looked at the child. Leia was watching her with those serious dark eyes, and she said, very quietly, she knew I'd come. She knew I wouldn't give up. The wind came across the highway in a long, cold gust, and the brown grass on the shoulder flattened and rose again, and Mara looked at the paper in her hand and thought about what it meant to build a system of hope around a 7-year-old, to trust in the worst moment of your life that your child would find a way through. She thought about the kind of mother who did that. She thought, we are going to find her. She stood up. She looked at Creed over the roof of the truck. We ditch the truck outside the next town, she said. We find a cash vehicle. We take Route 12 without phones. If Bear needs to find us, he finds us the old way. The old way, Creed said. He knows the coastal stations. He knows which one. She met his eyes. He'll figure it out. And if Victor's federal contact is already running camera pulls on the coast, then we move faster than the pull. She got in the truck. Get on the bike. He got on the bike. They drove south. The town was called Bexford, and it had a population of 800 and a hardware store and a bar and a mechanic's lot on the edge of town, where 3 vehicles sat with for sale signs behind the windshields. Mara pulled in, walked to the mechanic's office, put cash on the counter for an 8-year-old Chevy pickup that ran correctly, and asked no questions of whoever drove it, transferred nothing from Ruth's truck except the road atlas and the page with Laya's drawing, and left Ruth's truck parked at the back of the lot with the keys under the seat. She felt the exposure of switching vehicles in a town with eyes, and she kept moving because stopping was worse. They were back on the road in 22 minutes. The rain started outside Bexford, coming in sideways off the mountains, the kind of rain that wasn't distinguishable from the wind that carried it. The wipers smeared it across the glass in long arcs. Creed's taillight was a red point in the gray ahead of her, steady and close. Leia said, "Are you scared?" Mara looked at the road. "Sometimes." "What do you do when you're scared?" "Keep moving," Mara said, "and pay attention." Leia absorbed this. She had the locket back around her neck, the chain tucked inside the collar of the too large jacket, hidden but present. She pressed her palm flat against the outside of the collar, over the place where the locket sat against her chest. "Mama says fear is just love with nowhere to go," she said. Mara's hands tightened on the wheel. She didn't say anything. She looked at the road and the rain and Creed's taillight in the gray ahead, and she felt the truth of the sentence land in her chest and stay there, undefended, because she was too tired and too cold and too far down this road to keep it out. They were 40 minutes from the Idaho border when the Chevy's radio, which she hadn't turned on, which was running on a residual signal from a previous station, crackled once and produced, for just a moment, a voice. She caught 2 words before the signal died. "Mercer woman." She reached for the dial. Nothing. Static. The signal was gone. But those 2 words. She looked at the rain on the windshield and she thought about the federal component and the burned diner and the riders off the road in Salmon City and the compass marks on the torn page in the road, Atlas on the seat beside her. And she thought about all the systems that were supposed to protect people and all the ways they had failed the specific people in this specific truck on this specific road. And then she thought about what Bear had said 3 years ago, in the last real conversation they'd had before she'd packed the saddlebags and ridden east. He'd said, "The thing about the life, Mara, is that it never actually lets you leave. It just lets you think you have." She'd been angry about it then. She understood it now in a way she hadn't wanted to. The Idaho border sign passed in the rain and disappeared behind them, and the road went on into the gray, and somewhere ahead of her through the mountains and the timber country and the long inland approach, the Oregon coast waited with its gray water and its rocky shore and an abandoned lighthouse where a woman had hidden the evidence that could end the thing that was chasing all of them. And somewhere between here and there, or already moving, Victor Raines was moving through timber country on a road that didn't appear on federal traffic monitoring maps, and he already knew where they were going. The Oregon coast arrived without announcement. One moment there was timber, Douglas fir pressing close on both sides of Route 12, the road narrow and poorly maintained, the kind of road that existed because it had always existed and not because anyone had recently decided it should. And then the trees thinned and the land dropped and the smell changed. Salt, cold water. The specific smell of the Pacific coast in November, which was the smell of something enormous and indifferent, older than any of the things happening on its shore. Mara saw the lighthouse before Creed signaled. It stood on a headland half a mile north of where Route 12 met the coastal road, white tower against gray sky. The light long dead. The keeper's house beside it reduced to a dark shape with most of its windows gone. The kind of structure that had been abandoned long enough to start belonging to the landscape rather than to the people who had built it. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, padlocked, with warning and no trespassing signs that the weather had been working on for years. Creed pulled off the road into a gravel turnout and killed the Harley. Mara stopped behind him. The coast was loud. That was the thing she hadn't fully anticipated. The noise of it, the constant low roar of the Pacific against the rocks below the headland. A sound that wasn't dramatic up close, but that saturated everything, that got underneath other sounds and made them harder to parse. She stood beside the truck in the cold and listened past the ocean for anything that shouldn't be there. Creed was beside her. He said nothing. He was doing the same thing. The parking area was empty. The access road to the lighthouse was gated. No fresh tire tracks that she could see, but the gravel was wet and the rain had been working on any tracks for hours. "I don't like it," Creed said. "Neither do I. Too quiet. Or actually quiet." She looked at the lighthouse. "We don't have time to like it." She went back to the truck and opened the passenger door. Leia was already sitting forward, the locket out and in her hand, the paper with her drawing pressed open across her knees. "Is that it?" Mara said. Leia looked at the lighthouse. Something moved across her face. Recognition, but more than recognition, something older and more complicated. The face of a child standing at the threshold of a memory that belonged to a different version of herself, one that hadn't been tied to a tree yet, one that had stood here with her mother and learned that this was a place for being brave. "That's it," she said. They cut the fence at the south corner away from the road, using the wire cutters from the Chevy's toolbox. Creed went through first, then Leia, then Mara. The ground between the fence and the keeper's house was overgrown with coastal grass, wet and knee-high, soaking their legs immediately. The wind off the ocean was serious here, the kind that leaned into you and expected you to acknowledge it. The keeper's house door was locked with a padlock that was newer than the rest of the property. Mara looked at it. Creed looked at it. "Someone's been maintaining this," he said. "Emma?" Mara said. He met her eyes. Then he stepped back and kicked the door. It took 2 kicks. The lock held, but the door frame didn't, the old wood giving with a sound like a gunshot that the ocean immediately swallowed. They went in. The interior smelled like salt damp, and old wood, and something else. Something recent, something human. Candle wax. The particular smell of a living space that had been occupied not long ago by someone trying to be invisible. Mara stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The main room had been cleared, old furniture pushed to the walls, a sleeping bag in the corner, compressed but not rolled, the way a sleeping bag looked when it had been vacated quickly. A camp stove on the floor, 3 cans of food, 2 of them open and empty, a water container, a flashlight with dead batteries. Someone had been here. Leia was already moving toward the far wall. She wasn't looking at the living evidence. She was looking at the floor. Specifically at a section of floorboard near the north corner, beneath where the window would have looked out over the ocean if the window had still had glass. She crouched down. Her small fingers found the edge of a board and pulled. It came up cleanly. No nails. It had been prepared. Underneath, a metal box, the kind sold at hardware stores for waterproof document storage. The latch closed but not locked. Leia looked up at Mara. Mara crossed the room and knelt beside her and opened the box. Inside, a hard drive. A folded document, handwritten, several pages. A second folded document that was printed, dense with text and numbers. And a photograph face down. Mara reached for the photograph. She turned it over. It was Emma Mercer, recognizable from the locket, but not laughing this time. Standing inside what looked like this room, the same room, thin and exhausted and with the particular look of someone who had been running on will alone for weeks. She was holding a handwritten sign against her chest, and on the sign she had written a date, 3 days ago, and 3 words beneath it, "Still here, waiting." The room went very still despite the ocean outside. "She was here 3 days ago," Creed said. "She's still here," Mara said. "Or was. She's been waiting for Leia." She looked around the room, the sleeping bag, the empty cans, the dead flashlight. Something moved her. Or someone found her. The word landed. Leia had gone completely still beside her, the metal box open in front of her, the photograph in Mara's hand. She was not looking at the photograph. She was looking at the space around her, reading it the way Mara had been reading it, and the look on her face was the most adult thing Mara had ever seen on a child's face, a 7-year-old doing rapid and precise assessment of what the evidence in front of her meant. "She left this for me," Leia said. "She knew I was coming. She left everything she had and she stopped." Her voice didn't break, but it came close, the structural integrity of it under visible pressure. "She's close. She has to be close." Mara was already standing. "Take the box," she said to Creed. She moved to the window opening, looked out across the headland. The ocean was below and to the west, the access road to the east. the coastal highway beyond that. To the north, the lighthouse tower stood against the sky, and at its base, movement. A figure moving fast along the base of the tower, heading toward the south side of the property, moving with the uneven gait of someone who was injured or exhausted, or both. Dark clothing. Hair loose in the wind. North, Mara said. Tower base, go. They went. Creed had the metal box under one arm. Mara had Leia's hand and she ran, through the keeper's house and out the broken door and across the wet grass, the wind pushing against them, the ocean roar surrounding everything. She saw the figure stop at the south corner of the tower and turn and see them and freeze. Even from 40 yards, even through the gray coastal light and the wind-driven mist, Mara could see the resemblance. The same dark eyes, the same stillness in a crisis. The photograph from the locket, three-dimensional and exhausted and real. Leia let go of Mara's hand. She ran. Emma Mercer caught her daughter and went to her knees in the wet coastal grass and held her with both arms, and the sound that came out of her was not a sound that Mara was going to be able to think about later without cost. It was the sound of someone returning from somewhere they hadn't been sure they'd come back from, finding the thing they'd held on for, releasing the held breath of weeks. Mara stood 10 feet away and looked at the access road. She had been listening under the ocean's roar the entire time they'd been on the property. She heard it now. Engines, not motorcycles. Vehicles, multiple, coming fast down the coastal access from the north. She saw the first headlights crest the rise 300 yards away, and then the second set, and then a third. She looked at Creed. He had already put himself between the approaching vehicles and the two figures on the ground. "How many?" he said. "3 vehicles minimum." She looked at Emma. "Can you run?" Emma looked up from her daughter. Her face was hollowed, and her left arm was held at an angle that wasn't right, and there was a bruise along her jaw that was several days old and yellow at the edges. But her eyes were clear, and the steadiness in them was the same steadiness as in her daughter's eyes, the family trait that had apparently survived everything. "Yes," Emma said. "The crawl space," Mara said. "Is there one? Under the house?" "South side, entrance behind the fuel tank." "Take Leia. Take the box. Go now." She looked at Leia, who was still holding her mother with both arms, face pressed against Emma's neck, eyes open and watching Mara over her mother's shoulder. "Go with your mother. Don't come out until I come for you." Leia looked at her for 1 second. Then she nodded. Emma gathered herself and took her daughter's hand and moved for the keeper's house without running, moving quickly, purposefully, the controlled pace of someone who understood that running drew eyes and walking didn't, a woman who had spent weeks surviving on exactly that kind of judgment. The headlights were 200 yards away. Mara looked at Creed. He had his hands loose at his sides and his chin slightly down, and his weight forward on the balls of his feet, and there was nothing in his face that could be described as afraid. There was something else there, the focused quietude of a man who had stood in bad situations before and had developed over years a relationship with those moments that wasn't peace exactly but was adjacent to it, the acceptance of the situation as it was rather than as it should have been. "Bears riders," he said. "Too far out." She looked at the vehicles. 200 yards. Slowing as they came onto the property approach. They knew where they were. 10 minutes, maybe? "We don't have 10 minutes. "No." The first vehicle stopped at the gate. A door opened. Then another. Dark figures, moving with the deliberate efficiency of people who had done this before, who were not improvising. 4. 5. She counted 6 before she stopped counting because the number stopped mattering, and then the figure who stepped out last, from the passenger side of the lead vehicle, was not one of the 6. He was taller than them, and he moved differently, not with the operational efficiency of hired purpose, but with the unhurried ease of a man who had arrived at a place he'd been heading for a long time and was in no particular hurry now that he was here. Victor Rains. He stopped at the gate line. He looked across the wet grass of the headland at Mara, and even from this distance, in this light, she could see the specific quality of the look he was giving her. Not rage, not urgency, just the cold and patient recognition of a man who had put someone on a list 7 years ago and had arrived, finally, at the bottom of it. He said something to the men beside him that she couldn't hear over the ocean. They started moving. Creed shifted his weight. "If we split their approach," he said very quietly, We can funnel them. Between the tower and the fence line. One at a time. Almost one at a time. She looked at the space between the lighthouse tower and the east fence. Narrow. 2 men could come through at once, but not 3. Not comfortably. It was the difference between fighting a force and fighting a sequence. You take the fence line side. You take the tower. Yes. A pause. The sound of boots on wet gravel still approaching. He said, Mara. She looked at him. He started to say something else. She could see it, the preparation of it in his face, something he'd been carrying since Garrett's farm, or maybe since longer than that, since 3 years ago, since whenever the thing was that he hadn't said and she hadn't stayed long enough to hear. Later, she said. His jaw closed. He nodded once. She turned to face Victor Rains and the 6 men spreading across the headland toward them, and she felt the cold Pacific wind against her face and the wet grass under her boots and the specific weight of everything that had led to this particular piece of ground, the fire, the rope, the child, the diner reduced to ash, the riders down outside Salmon City, Emma's photograph with its 3-word message that had turned a search into a rescue into this. And she thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrived in these moments and could not be manufactured or summoned at any other time, that she had not turned the bike around that night because she was brave. She had turned it around because she was finally tired enough of running to remember what she'd been running from. The first 2 men cleared the gate at a jog, and Victor Rains stood at the property line with his hands in his jacket pockets watching, and the ocean was loud and cold and enormous behind them all, and Mara Vale moved forward into the space between the lighthouse tower and the east fence line, and the first man reached her before she'd fully committed to the angle, which meant she had to adjust, and adjusting cost her the first hit. It caught her across the left shoulder, the bad shoulder, the one with the scar tissue that never fully softened, and the impact radiated down her arm in a white spike of sensation that she catalogued and set aside, because there was no useful thing to do with pain in the first 30 seconds of a physical confrontation except acknowledge it had arrived and continue. She used the momentum of the hit to turn rather than absorb it, got her right elbow into the man's ribs as she came around, felt the contact, heard the exhale. He went sideways. Not down. Sideways, which meant he was experienced enough to roll with force rather than resist it, which meant she was not dealing with hired bodies, but with people who knew how to do this. She registered that and filed it and moved. The second man was closer than she'd anticipated. They'd spread their spacing deliberately, accounting for exactly the funneling tactic she and Creed had chosen, which meant Victor had briefed them on basic engagement mechanics, which meant Victor had been planning this encounter rather than reacting to it. She took a knee strike to the thigh that would leave a bruise the size of a dinner plate and threw a headbutt that connected badly, mostly forehead to cheekbone, the pain splitting evenly between them. To her left, she could hear Creed. She didn't look. She knew his sounds in a confrontation the way she knew the sound of his bike, the specific rhythm of him, the particular intervals between contact and recovery. He was handling the fence line side. She didn't look because looking was how you got hurt. She put the second man down with a joint lock that she'd learned from a woman in New Mexico 12 years ago and had used approximately 4 times since, and the man went down with his arm at an angle that would require medical attention before he tried to use it again. She stepped over him. The third man stopped. He was maybe 20 feet away, and he had stopped moving, and he was holding something at his side that was not his hand, and Mara stopped too. And for a second the only sound was the ocean and the wind and the distant struggle at the fence line and the very close sound of her own breathing, which was ragged in a way she'd have to think about later. Victor Rains spoke from somewhere behind the man. "That's enough." His voice was exactly as she'd constructed it from the 4 times she'd heard it 7 years ago. Smooth, controlled, with the specific quality of a man who had spent so long performing calm that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing, if there was a real thing. "Put it down," he said to the man. The man put it down. Mara didn't move. Victor walked through the space between his men with his hands still in his jacket pockets, and he looked at her the way a person looked at a problem they had been working on for a long time and had finally solved to their satisfaction, and he stopped 8 feet away. He was older than she remembered. Not by the number of years, she knew the years, could calculate them, but by something else. some quality that had compacted in him, settled in his face like sediment. The charm was still there in the architecture of it, the practiced easiness in his posture. But underneath it was something that had given up trying to hide itself, something flat and cold and patient. "Mara Vale," he said. "Victor, you look like you've had a difficult week. You set a child on fire," she said. "Your comparison is off." Something shifted minimally in his face. Not guilt, not even the pretense of it. Something more like recalibration, the face of a man updating a variable. "Where's the box?" he said. "What box?" "Emma's box, the drive. I know she left something here. I know the girl led you to it." "I don't know what you're talking about." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been looking for that woman for 3 months, he said. 3 months of watching her make bad decisions and protect people who couldn't protect her back. A pause. "She's very loyal. It's her worst quality." "Where is she?" Mara said. Something moved at the periphery of her vision, and she tracked it without moving her head. 2 of Victor's men circling wide, flanking, taking positions that would cut off the retreat toward the keeper's house. She counted what she could see. Victor. 3 men standing, 2 she'd put down. Creed still engaged at the fence line. 6 was the number she'd counted at the gate, and she couldn't account for all 6. "She's comfortable," Victor said. "She's been here, actually. Did you know that? She's been on this property for 3 days waiting for her daughter. I found her this morning." He paused. "She's in the vehicle." Mara's jaw tightened. "I haven't heard her," he said in the tone of a man presenting a credential. "I want the drive, Mara. That's all. The drive. And I'm gone. And Emma Mercer can have her daughter and her life and whatever story she wants to tell about the last 3 months. Nobody needs to know anything. Nobody needs to be—" "You burned Ruth's diner," Mara said. A pause. "That was unfortunate. You put a bounty on a 7-year-old. That was precautionary. You tied her to a tree," Mara said, "and you lit the forest." The pause this time was different. He looked at her. "She heard things she shouldn't have heard. She's 7. She has a very good memory." The words came out of him with the same smooth evenness as everything else. And that was the thing. That was the thing that had always been the thing about Victor Rains. That the monstrousness of what he said occupied the same tonal register as everything else he said. That there was no gear change, no inflection that acknowledged the difference between a casual remark and an admission of attempted murder of a child. The flatness of it. The absolute lack of internal weather. Mara thought about Leia in the crawlspace. Leia and Emma in the crawlspace with the metal box and the hard drive and 3 pages of Emma's handwritten account and the printed financial documentation. All of it, the entire architecture of what Emma Mercer had spent 3 months building and surviving to preserve. She thought about what Victor had just told her, that Emma was in the vehicle, that he'd found her this morning, which meant Emma had not made it to the crawlspace, which meant Leia was in the crawlspace alone. "I'll get you the drive," Mara said. Victor's eyes changed slightly. "Good. But Emma walks to me first, right now." A beat. He considered this with the visible calculation of a man weighing leverage. Then he turned slightly and said something to one of the men behind him. Mara watched the man walk back to the vehicles. She kept her eyes on Victor. "You came a long way for this," he said. "So did you. This is my property, in a manner of speaking. Emma is she's important to me. She's terrified of you." That's a mischaracterization. "She scratched a map into her daughter's locket," Mara said. "She faked her disappearance. She carried evidence through 3 states injured and alone. That's not a mischaracterization. That's a woman who knew exactly what you were." His jaw tightened, just slightly. The first crack in the surface. "Emma made choices," he said. "She made choices about what to look into and what to share and with whom. Those choices had consequences. The consequences you're describing are you." Mara. The sound of the ocean filled the pause between them, cold and enormous and utterly indifferent to the small human accounting happening on the headland above it. She heard the vehicle door, she heard footsteps on gravel. She did not take her eyes off Victor until Emma Mercer appeared at the edge of the peripheral frame, and then she looked, and what she saw was a woman who had been through something that had left visible marks. The wrist that was held carefully, The way she moved with the exaggerated precision of someone managing pain, the bruising that was older than today, the expression on her face that was compounded from exhaustion and fear, and something underneath both of those, some residue of Emma Mercer before all of this, some quality that had apparently survived everything Victor had done and intended to do. Emma stopped. She was looking at Mara. She said, "The crawl space." Barely a sound, a shape of words. Mara understood. She gave the smallest possible nod. Emma's eyes closed for 1 second, then opened. "The drive," Victor said. He was looking at Mara. He hadn't looked at Emma since she'd appeared. Where? That was when the Harleys arrived. She heard them before she saw them. 6 distinct engine voices coming in from the south, off Route 12, the specific acoustic signature of multiple large displacement engines running in loose formation, the sound that Route 12 had probably never heard before and would absorb into its particular geography and hold there the way landscapes held the sounds of significant events. They came over the coastal rise, and their headlights swept across the headland in a long arc, illuminating the grass and the fence and the lighthouse tower and the figures standing on the wet ground, and Victor turned toward the sound for the first time. Bear had sent them all. There were 7 bikes. She'd told Bear the coastal station, the old way, the way you communicated when phones were gone, a specific shorthand developed over years of operating in territories with no cell coverage, a set of reference points that meant specific things. He'd understood. He'd sent 7. They didn't come through the gate. They came through the fence. Creed had cut a second section while she'd been keeping Victor talking. She understood this without needing to see it, understood that the sound she'd been hearing at the fence line for the last 4 minutes hadn't been just the confrontation she'd assumed, but also the deliberate opening of an entry point, and the bikes came through it and spread across the headland with the controlled precision of people who had done this before, who had ridden into bad situations before and had come out the other side carrying whatever it had cost them. Bear was in front. Raymond Calhoun was 61 years old and had been riding since he was 17 and had the accumulated evidence of that on his body. The weathered face, the gray in his beard that had been arriving for a decade, the way he dismounted with the careful economy of someone whose joints had opinions about motorcycles now. He had a scar along his left jaw from something that had happened in 1994 that he had never explained to anyone who asked, and eyes that were the color of creek water in autumn, brown and gold and cool, and he walked across the wet grass of the headland toward Victor Raines with his hands loose at his sides and the absolute unhurried confidence of a man who had assessed the situation from 100 yards out and had found it manageable. Victor's men were looking at the bikes. All of them. The 2 who had been flanking had stopped flanking and were reassessing. The man Mara had put down was sitting up and looking at the situation with the expression of someone revising their expectations for the evening. Victor himself had gone very still. Bear stopped 6 feet from him. He looked at Victor for a moment. Then he looked at Mara. "You look terrible," he said. "You're late," she said. "Route 12 is not a good road." He looked back at Victor. "Victor." "Raymond," Victor said. His voice had shifted. The smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had changed frequency. "This doesn't involve the Iron Compass." "The Iron Compass isn't here," Bear said. "These are private citizens on a public access headland." A pause. "Who happen to ride Harleys?" "You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean." Bear's voice was very quiet. The ocean was louder than he was. "I also know what you did to a child in a burning forest 6 days ago, Victor. And I know about Emma Mercer, and I know about the federal contact you've been running, and I know about Salmon City." He let each item land. "So when you tell me this doesn't involve anyone, I want you to think carefully about whether that's the argument you want to make right now." Victor looked at the riders spread across the headland. He looked at Mara. He looked at Emma, who had moved during the arrival, had moved quietly and without drawing attention to herself, had moved until she was standing behind the line of bikers, protected by it, her injured arm held against her chest, and her face turned toward the keeper's house, toward the crawl space. Victor Raines was not a stupid man. That had always been part of the problem with him. Stupid men were predictable. Victor was a man who recalculated constantly and quickly and who understood leverage and its limits, and when a situation had shifted past the point where his particular version of leverage applied. He looked at Bear for a long moment. Then he said, "The drive is inadmissible. Whatever Emma thinks she has—" "Probably," Bear said. "That's for other people to sort out. The photographs are different. The financial transfers are different. The testimony of a woman who was there is different." He paused. "The testimony of a federal employee who helped you run surveillance on protected witnesses is very different." Victor's face changed. "We found your contact," Bear said simply. "He talked before you could tell him not to." The wind came in off the Pacific and moved through the coastal grass, and it was very cold and very clean, and it smelled like salt and distance, like the smell of all the water between this headland and the next landmass, thousands of miles of open ocean that didn't know or care about any of this. Victor Raines looked at Bear Calhoun and Mara Vale and the riders standing in the wet grass, and Emma Mercer standing behind them, and he made the calculation that a man makes when the variables have finally and completely run out, and his face went through something that Mara watched with the careful attention of someone who had been waiting for it, and still wasn't sure what shape it would take. It took the shape of a man sitting down in the grass, not dramatically, not as a gesture. He just sat down, like his legs had decided they were done with the performance. He sat in the wet coastal grass of the headland in his jacket with his hands in front of him, and he looked at nothing in particular. "Call it in," he said. To no one specific. One of his men reached for a phone. Mara looked at Bear. He nodded once. The sirens were 18 minutes arriving, which was fast for a stretch of coast with this little infrastructure, and she found out later that Bear had called ahead. Had called the state police, not the federal line, specifically the state police, and had given them a location and a name, and the specific statement that the name was connected to interstate trafficking, and that there was evidence on site, and that there were private citizens present who were not involved and would not be obstructing anything. 18 minutes. She used them. She went to the keeper's house, and she went to the south side where Emma had directed her, and she found the crawlspace entrance behind the fuel tank, a low wooden hatch latched from the inside. She knocked 3 times. A pause. Then the latch moved. Leia's face appeared in the gap, low and dirt-smudged, her eyes scanning the space above and behind Mara before they settled on her. Reading the situation, deciding. She decided. She pushed the hatch fully open and crawled out, and she was holding the metal box against her chest with both arms, having apparently spent the last however many minutes in a crawl space under an abandoned building on the Oregon coast, guarding her mother's evidence with her body, which was exactly the kind of thing that stopped being surprising once you understood the full shape of who Leia Mercer was. Mara took the box from her. "Your mother," she said, "is outside. She's all right." Leia looked at her. "All right, like actually all right, or all right like you're saying that so I don't panic." Mara looked at this 7-year-old child. "She's hurt," she said. "Her wrist. She needs a hospital, but she's standing up and she's waiting for you." Leia processed this with the same precision she processed everything. Then she went around the side of the house at a pace that was technically not running, but was everything running was except the form of it. Mara stood alone beside the fuel tank for a moment. The ocean was loud. Her left shoulder had settled from white pain to the deep, grinding ache of something that was going to require ice and time, and probably a conversation with the doctor she didn't have. Her knuckles were split on the right hand. She was wet through from the coastal grass. She listened to the sound of Leia finding her mother. She didn't go around the corner of the house immediately. She gave them the moment. It seemed like the least she could do for 2 people who had been trying to get back to each other for 3 months. When she did go around, Emma was on her knees in the grass with Leia in her arms, and her face pressed into her daughter's hair, and Leia was talking, rapidly, detailing everything, the fire and the truck and the diner and the farm and the route and the lighthouse, all of it delivered in the compressed, urgent tones of a child reporting a mission completed, and Emma was listening and crying and saying nothing, just holding, just the specific fierce hold of a woman who had survived 3 months of terrible things in order to be able to do exactly this. Creed appeared beside Mara. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye that he was holding closed with 2 fingers. He looked at the mother and daughter in the wet grass. He looked at Mara. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They stood there in the coastal wind and let it be what it was. The state police arrived in 3 vehicles and a 4th that turned out to be federal oversight. Specifically, a federal investigator named Ortega, who had apparently been building a parallel case on Victor's network for 14 months and who had been informed, through Bear's communication earlier that evening, that the ground had shifted significantly under the case she'd been building. She was a small woman in her 40s who walked across the headland with the expression of someone who had been working toward a specific moment for a long time, and was now standing in it and finding it both exactly and nothing like what she'd imagined. She looked at the metal box in Mara's hand. "Is that—" "Emma Mercer's documentation," Mara said. "Financial records, a hard drive, handwritten account, and printed transaction logs. Chain of custody. Emma Mercer to a secure location on this property, accessed by Leah Mercer under instruction from her mother, held by the child in the crawl space for approximately 30 minutes, transferred to me when I retrieved her." She held it out. "I didn't open the drive. I opened the box to verify contents in the presence of a witness." She looked at Creed. "He can testify to that, whenever necessary," Creed said. Ortega took the box. She looked at it for a moment with an expression that had something in it that wasn't professional. Something human, the face of a person receiving something they had been looking for in the dark for a long time. Then she composed herself and the professional returned. "We're going to need statements from everyone present," she said. "We know," Bear said from behind them. He had come up quietly. Bear always came up quietly. He looked at Ortega with the measured assessment of a man who had been on the wrong side of law enforcement often enough to have a complicated relationship with it, and had found, over the years, a specific equilibrium. Not trust, not hostility, but a clear-eyed recognition of where the interests aligned. "My people will cooperate fully," he said, "in exchange for acknowledgement that their presence here tonight was as private citizens responding to a request for assistance." A pause. "And for the formal record to reflect that the evidence was secured by Emma Mercer and her daughter before any club-affiliated individuals arrived on site." Ortega looked at him. "The case is better without the complications," Bear said. Simply. "You know it is." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at the box in her hands. "I'll see what I can do," she said. It was not a promise. Bear didn't need it to be. Victor Raines was arrested on the headland with the ocean behind him and the lighthouse tower above him and the collected evidence of what he'd built and what he'd done in the hands of a federal investigator who had been building toward this for 14 months. He didn't resist. He didn't perform dignity or indignation. He got up from the wet grass and he put his hands where the officers indicated, and he was walked to the vehicle, and he looked at nothing in particular on the way, and then the door closed and Mara watched the vehicle's taillights reach the access road and turn north and disappear. She stood looking at where they'd gone for a moment. She thought, 7 years. She thought, he put a child on a list and set a forest on fire. She thought, it's over. She thought, it doesn't feel like anything yet. That was the thing about the end of long-running fears. They didn't announce themselves as resolved with any particular sensation. The fear had been part of the internal architecture for so long that its absence was indistinguishable, at first from its continued presence. She would feel it later, probably. She would feel it in stages, over days and weeks, in the quiet moments when the body ran its inventory and found something missing from the column where the threat had lived. For now, she just felt the cold and the wet and the ache in her shoulder. Emma was taken to a coastal hospital by ambulance. The wrist was fractured, the ribs bruised, the accumulated effects of 3 months of running visible in the weight she'd lost, and the vitamin deficiency showing in her pallor, and the way her hands shook slightly when she was still enough for the shaking to be visible. Leah rode in the ambulance with her. She held her mother's good hand the entire way, and she talked, continued the account she'd started on the headland, filling her mother in on everything, the complete record of the week, delivered with the precise and slightly breathless verbal report style of someone who had decided that information was the thing they could provide and was providing all of it. Emma listened. She looked at her daughter's face. She didn't let go of her hand. Mara watched the ambulance leave from the headland. Bear came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a while, the way people stood in silence when they had known each other for a long time, and the silence was a language they both spoke. "You're riders," she said eventually. "Salmon City. Kemp is in the hospital. Broken collarbone, concussion. He'll be all right." A pause. "Darius didn't make it off the road." She closed her eyes. Darius had been 28 years old. She had ridden with him twice, briefly, in the last months before she'd left. He'd had a laugh that arrived before everything else, before any indication that he was going to laugh, just this sudden sound of genuine delight at something ordinary. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I." They stood with that. "You should have told me about the list," she said, 3 years ago. "Yes," Bear said, "I should have." He didn't defend it, he didn't explain, he let the admission be what it was. "I thought I was protecting you. From information. From a decision. I thought if you knew, you'd come back. I thought you needed the road more than you needed to know." He paused. "I was wrong about which one mattered more." She looked at the place where Victor's vehicle had been, the flattened grass. "You were right that I'd come back. I was wrong about the reason." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "You didn't come back for Victor. You came back for a child you'd never met." He held her gaze with those creek water eyes. "That's different. That's the version of you that was always going to come back when the right thing came along." She thought about the shoulder of Route 9 and a phone in her hand and the moment before the sound became a screaming she could name. She thought about the calculation that hadn't been a calculation, that had happened below the level of decision, below the architecture of detachment she'd been building and living in for 3 years. "I just heard her," she said. Bear nodded. "That's all it ever takes." The riders were moving on the headland, the post-operation dispersal. Bikes being walked back to the fence line break, riders checking each other's damage with the economy of people for whom this kind of accounting was routine. The specific quiet competence of a group that had been in a situation and had come through it and was now doing the practical work of what came after. No celebration, no performance, just the methodical closing of the thing. Creed was getting the cut above his eye taped by a rider named Santos, who had apparently decided in the absence of medical supplies that electrical tape would do in the short term, and was applying it with a focused exactness that Mara found somehow almost funny. Creed was tolerating this with the expression of a man who had strong opinions about it and had decided not to express them. He looked at her across the headland. She looked back. She crossed to him. Santos finished the tape application, assessed his work with apparent satisfaction, and removed himself with the tact of someone who understood when a conversation was about to need its space. "You were going to say something," Mara said, "on the headland, before they came through the fence." He looked at her. The electrical tape above his eye made him look slightly piratical, which was not the word for him, but was somehow accurate in this moment. "I don't remember." "You remember." He was quiet for a moment. The ocean was loud behind them both. "I was going to say that it's good you turned the bike around," he said, "that night on Route 9. Whoever made that call, whatever part of you that was, I'm glad it made it." A pause. "I know that's not—" He stopped. "It's not the eloquent version." "It doesn't need to be eloquent," she said. He nodded. He looked at the ocean. She looked at the ocean, too. They stood there with the Pacific in front of them, and the dead lighthouse above them, and the dispersing bikes behind them, and all the miles of mountain and highway and burning forest between here and the beginning of the week. And she felt the weight of it, the way you felt the weight of something you'd been carrying after you finally set it down, felt it by its absence, in the specific exhaustion of muscles that had been under load and were now, cautiously, being allowed to rest. The drive to the hospital took 40 minutes on the coastal road, and by the time they arrived, Emma had been taken to imaging, and Leia was in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee with a borrowed hospital blanket around her shoulders. She was sitting in a chair that was too large for her, with her feet not quite reaching the floor, and her eyes open and tracking everyone who came through the door. When Mara came through the door, Leia's face did the thing it had been doing all week, the thing Mara had stopped trying to describe to herself because the descriptions were inadequate. It went through something, some fast and private recalibration, and then settled into something that looked like, but was not quite the same as, relief. "She's getting x-rays," Leia said. "I know." Mara sat down in the chair beside her. "She's going to be okay." "I know she is," stated flatly. Not as reassurance, but as determination. The declaration of a child who had decided the outcome and was holding to it the way you held to things when the alternative was not something you were willing to consider. Then, more quietly. I knew she was still alive. I knew it the whole time. Everyone kept saying gone like gone, but I knew she wasn't. You were right, Mara said. She taught me to trust what I know. A pause. She said the people who tell you not to trust yourself are usually the people who need you not to. Mara sat with that for a moment. Emma Mercer, whom she'd known for approximately 45 minutes total, kept arriving in the conversation in ways that were more vivid than most people Mara had known for years. She sounds like someone worth finding, Mara said. Leia looked at her. You found her. You led me to her. The child considered this. She seemed to find the distribution of credit acceptable. She looked at the waiting room door and then back at Mara, and then she said, What happens now? It was the question, the one Mara had been sitting with since she'd watched the ambulance leave the headland. The logistics of now, the statements, the federal investigation, the evidence, the case that would wind through systems for months before it resolved into whatever it resolved into. The more immediate logistics of a woman with a fractured wrist and bruised ribs and a 7-year-old daughter and no home to go back to, because going back to the home they'd had meant going back to the geography of Victor, and that was not going to be possible or healthy or wise. There was the question of where. There was the question of what came after the case and the testimony and the long bureaucratic aftermath of dismantling a network that reached across 3 states. One thing at a time, Mara said. Tonight is just about your mother being okay. Leia absorbed this. She nodded. She looked at the door again. Then, Are you going to leave? The word leave sat in the antiseptic-smelling waiting room. Mara looked at the linoleum floor and the flickering overhead light and the water-stained ceiling tiles, and she thought about the saddlebags she'd packed 3 years ago, and the road east, and all the highway miles she'd accumulated since, the long practice of being nowhere that you could be found and nowhere that required anything from you. She thought about Creed at the fence line, tape above his eye, watching her across a headland. She thought about Bear's voice saying, that's the version of you that was always going to come back. She thought about Ruth Harper pressing keys into her hand in a diner that was now ash. She thought about the specific weight of a child in a burning forest. Not tonight, she said. Leia looked at her. Not for a while, Mara said, and meant it in the way that surprised her. Not as a concession, not as the reluctant surrender of a woman who had been cornered into warmth, but as something that arrived from below the level of decision and felt, when she examined it, like the same quality as the moment she'd turned the bike around. Below thought. Below strategy. The part of her that had always known things she'd spent years trying to outrun. Creed appeared in the waiting room doorway. He had a paper cup of coffee in each hand, and the electrical tape still above his eye, and the specific look of a man who had purchased coffee primarily to have a reason to be somewhere rather than because he needed coffee. He held one cup out to Leia. She looked at it. Is that for me? Hot chocolate, he said. They had a machine. He said it like the machine's existence had been a matter of some relief. Leia took the cup. Creed sat down on Mara's other side and held the second cup out to her, and she took it. And it was bad coffee, the machine kind, and she drank it anyway. The 3 of them sat in the hospital waiting room while the overhead light flickered softly and the coastal wind pressed at the windows, and the sea was audible even here, a low and constant presence, the sound of something enormous and patient and deeply unimpressed by everything happening on its shore. Emma came out of imaging 2 hours later on Bear's count. He'd arrived at the hospital with 2 of his riders, and was occupying the waiting room with the contained and undemanding presence of large men who have decided to be somewhere quietly. Emma came out in a hospital gown, with her wrist wrapped and her hair down, and her face carrying the specific expression of someone who had reached the far side of something and was standing in the aftermath, in the strange flat landscape of what came after survival. She saw Leia, and Leia saw her. What happened between them was not for anyone else. It was a private closing of the gap, a private accounting between a mother and a daughter who had been separated by the worst 3 months of their lives and had both, separately, held on. Mara looked away from it because it deserved to be private, and because looking at it cost her something she wasn't ready to examine. She felt Creed's arm against hers, just the contact of it. Not reaching for anything, not offering anything, just present. She didn't move away. Later, an hour later, maybe more, the hospital time that had no relationship to clock time, she found herself in the parking lot. The coastal air was cold and the sky to the east had begun to make the transition from deep black to the color that came before color, the anticipatory gray of a sky that was deciding to become morning. Bear came and stood beside her. He lit a cigarette, which she hadn't seen him do in years. He smoked it with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had earned the cigarette and intended to honor it. He didn't offer her one. He knew she'd quit. Federal investigation is going to take months, he said. I know. Emma and Leah will need somewhere stable while it's ongoing. I know. Ruth Harper's situation is, I'll take care of Ruth, Mara said. He looked at her. She lost her diner because she helped me, Mara said. I'll take care of it. He nodded. He smoked. And you? She looked at the parking lot, at the motorcycle parked at the far end of it, her Harley, which Creed had apparently retrieved from the Route 9 shoulder and ridden to the lighthouse and then here, which was either the most practical or the most deliberate thing she could imagine him doing, and she couldn't decide which. I'm going to stay for a while, she said. Creed's staying. I don't know. I haven't asked him. Bear smoked. He rode here from eastern Montana in a night, he said, without inflection. I know. For you, not for the mission. Bear. I'm just noting the data. Stop noting. He finished the cigarette. He dropped it and pressed it out under his boot with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lot of time in fire country and had the habit of that thoroughness even in a hospital parking lot. I'm sorry, he said, about the 3 years, about Darius. He held her gaze. About all of it. She looked at him. Raymond Calhoun, 61 years old, gray-bearded and creekwater-eyed, who had been running the Iron Compass since before Mara had been old enough to ride, and who had made the decisions he'd made with the information he'd had and the framework he'd operated in, which was a human framework and therefore imperfect and capable of the specific kind of wrong that came not from malice but from the assumption that protection looked like withholding. I know, she said. He nodded. He went back inside. She stood in the parking lot alone for a while. The sky was definitely doing something now. The east was lightening in the specific way that happened in the last 40 minutes before dawn, the darkness becoming translucent rather than solid, the stars beginning to lose their definition. The hospital was behind her, warm and lit. The road was in front of her. The Harley was at the far end of the lot, patient and unchanged, the way it always was. She didn't walk toward it. She stood where she was. Creed came outside about 10 minutes later. He came and stood beside her, and he looked at the lightening sky, and he didn't say anything for a while, which was exactly right. Then, Emma asked about you. What did she ask? She asked if you were going to be all right. A pause. I said I thought so. What made you think so? He looked at her. The electrical tape above his eye had finally given up and was hanging at an angle. He reached up and peeled it off with the wincing expression of a man who had been expecting this for some time. Because you're still here, he said. You went into a burning forest. You drove through Montana in a stolen truck. You navigated a federal infiltration, and you're standing in a parking lot watching the sun come up. He paused. That's not the behavior of a woman who isn't going to be all right. She thought about that. She thought, 3 years of very careful nothing, and I got here anyway. She thought, maybe the road and the home are not the opposites I thought they were. She said, the lodge outside Billings, above Dutch's garage. There's room. Creed was quiet for a moment. Room for what? He said. For staying, she said. For a while. If someone wanted to. He looked at her. She looked at the sky. Dutch still has that garage? He said. Far as I know. You know about any of this? No? He's going to hear about it eventually. Dutch doesn't ask questions, she said. He just makes coffee. Creed was quiet for another moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. The particular sound of a man who had been hoping for something and had received it and was pretending, unsuccessfully, not to have been hoping. Okay, he said. The sky was pink at the rim now, the first actual color of the day arriving over the mountains that were somewhere east of the coast, invisible but present, the way so many things in Montana were. The hospital door opened. Leah appeared, her small face visible in the door crack, looking for them. She found Mara, and the look she gave her was the same look she'd given her in the waiting room. That fast, private recalibration, and then the thing that settled underneath it. Mara walked back to the door. "Mama wants to know if you're going to come in," Laya said. "She says it's cold and you should have coffee. She's been in a hospital bed for 2 hours. She's been asking about coffee since they let her sit up." Leia said it with the tolerant exasperation of someone who had been managing this particular trait for 7 years and had made peace with it. "She says the hospital coffee is terrible." "The hospital coffee is terrible," Creed confirmed from behind Mara. Leia looked at him, at the evidence of the electrical tape's removal above his eye, at the residue of adhesive still visible on his forehead. "You should get that looked at," she said. "I know." "Inside," she said. "There are doctors inside." He looked at Mara. "Go get your head looked at," Mara said. He went. Leia looked up at Mara. The sky was lightening behind them both, the first real morning light of the day beginning to separate objects from shadows. Leia's face in that light was tired and clean and serious and 7 years old, and also, Mara thought, much older than any of that, permanently older in the way that certain weeks made you permanently older, the kind of age that didn't come from years but from what you'd carried through them. She put her small hand in Mara's scarred one. "Come on," she said. Mara looked down at the small hand in hers. At the connection of it, child's hand, her hand, the specific arithmetic of what had happened between these two people in the space of 1 week. The fire and the rope and the cold truck and the borrowed jacket and all the miles of Montana highway and the lighthouse and the headland and the waiting room, and now this, a parking lot at dawn with a hand in hers and a door held open. She felt something shift, deep internal, below the level of anything she had language for. The thing that had been building since the shoulder of Route 9, since the moment below thought, since the part of her that knew things she'd spent years trying to outrun had turned the bike around and gone into the smoke. "Okay," Mara Vale said, and she went in. Inside, Emma Mercer was sitting up in a hospital bed with a blanket across her lap and the specific look of someone who had survived something and was in the beginning stages of understanding what surviving was going to feel like going forward. The coffee from the nurse's station was indeed terrible. Emma drank it anyway with her good hand and watched her daughter come through the door and then watched the woman who had come in after her, and she had the expression of someone doing a very thorough accounting. "Sit down," Emma said. Mara sat down. Emma looked at her for a long moment, at the bruises and the ash that was still somehow in her hair and the split knuckles and the general evidence of the week. "Thank you," Emma said. Mara looked at her hands. "I mean it," Emma said. "Not as a courtesy. I mean it specifically and completely." Her voice was steady in the way that things were steady that had been broken and repaired, the kind of steadiness that came from having been tested rather than from having been untested. "She told me everything. Everything you did." A pause. "You went into a burning forest for a child you'd never met." "I heard her," Mara said. She stopped. "Heard her," Emma finished. "Yes." She looked at Leia, who had positioned herself on the edge of the hospital bed with the natural claim of a child reclaiming the space beside her mother. She has always been very loud when she needs to be. Something moved in her face. "I knew someone would hear her. I told myself someone would hear her. I just didn't know who." "She would have found a way regardless," Mara said. She stopped again. Emma waited. "She's remarkable," Mara said. Inadequately. She knew it was inadequate as she said it, knew it didn't contain what she meant, which was the specific quality of Leia Mercer that Mara had been watching all week, and that didn't have a name because it wasn't a single thing. It was the locket gripped in the fist rather than the throat. It was the drawing produced from memory under a Montana sky. It was present tense in a waiting room. It was the nod on the night of the fire, the first adult nod Mara had ever received from someone who weighed less than 40 pounds. Emma looked at her daughter. "I know," she said. "She always has been." The morning came the rest of the way in while they sat in the hospital room, and the terrible coffee was replaced with slightly less terrible coffee that Creed brought from somewhere down the hall, and Bear came in and sat in the corner and said nothing, but was present in the way that Bear was always present in rooms he entered, the gravitational quality of a man who had been a fixed point for long enough that rooms reorganized themselves slightly around him. The writers were in the waiting room. The coastal air came through the cracked window above Emma's bed, and it was cold and clean and tasted like salt and distance. Outside, beyond the hospital and the coastal road and the rocky shore, the Pacific was the same. Enormous and patient, and turning under the early light, gray becoming silver, becoming something closer to blue, the way it always did, indifferent to the small human accounting of the night before and the morning after. Mara sat in a chair in a hospital room and drank bad coffee and listened to Leia tell her mother, in precise and thorough detail, about the big brown dog at Garrett's farm, and the way Emma laughed at that. Actually laughed. Head back, the laugh of someone who hadn't laughed in 3 months and had just discovered the mechanism still worked. Felt like something Mara was going to carry with her for a long time. Not as a wound. For once. Not as a wound. Outside, her Harley sat in the hospital parking lot under the morning sky. Patient as it always was, the road ready when she was. It would always be ready. That was the nature of roads. They didn't go anywhere. They waited. And when you were ready for them, they were there. She wasn't ready yet. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't ready yet. And the not readiness didn't feel like failure or softness or the slow erosion of the careful distance she'd been building. It felt like something else. Something she was only beginning to find the word for. Something that felt, if she was being accurate, a great deal like home.